Hello. In this quiet moment you found for yourself, I will take you far away, on a mystical journey guided by waves and stars. Across 50 chapters, we will follow in the footsteps of Captain Silas. Focus on your breath, let your bed carry your weight, and prepare for a deep sleep in the peace of this tale. The blue moon and the great pearl are waiting for you. The sun was setting over the busy harbor. Captain Silas walked slowly toward a large stone building near the water. His boots made a heavy sound on the wooden docks. He was a tall man with a tired face and grey hair. He wore an old blue coat and a black hat. He looked at the ships in the water, but his heart was heavy with worry. Inside the stone building, the air was still and smelled of old paper. Silas entered a large room filled with expensive furniture and tall shelves. A man sat behind a heavy wooden desk. This was Mr. Thorn. He was the richest merchant in the city, and he was a very mean man. He wore gold rings on his fingers and a red silk suit. "You are late, Silas," Mr. Thorn said. He did not look up from a long piece of paper. "I want my gold today. You promised to pay me after your last trip." Silas stood in front of the desk and held his hat in his hands. He did not have the gold. The storm last month was very big and very dangerous. Silas explained. "The waves were like mountains. I lost the cargo in the deep, dark sea. I need more time to find the money." Thorn looked up. His eyes were cold and sharp. "I do not care about the weather or the waves. I only care about my gold. You owe me 5,000 gold coins. That is a lot of money, Captain. If you do not pay me by tomorrow morning, I will take your ship. My guards are ready to move onto the deck." Silas felt a sharp office in his chest. The blue moon was his ship. It was his home and his only friend. He spent 20 years on that ship. "You cannot take my ship," Silas said with a low voice. "It is the only thing I have." Thorn smiled, but it was a cruel smile. He opened a small drawer in his desk and pulled out an old, yellow map. "There is another way to pay me, Silas. People speak of a legendary treasure. It is the Great Pearl. Some say it is as large as a man's head. It is hidden in the Blue Lagoon, far to the south. It is worth more than 10 of your ships. Find it for me, and your debt is gone forever." Silas knew the stories of the Great Pearl. The lagoon was in a part of the ocean with sharp rocks and many legends of danger. Many brave sailors went to look for it, but they never returned. "That is a very dangerous journey," Silas said. "Many men die in those waters." "Then give me the keys to your ship now," Thorn replied. He leaned back in his chair and waited. "The choice is yours, Captain. The pearl or the life of a poor man on the docks." Silas looked out the window. He saw the tall masts of his ship in the distance. He could not lose her. "I will find the pearl," Silas said finally. "Good," Thorn said. "You have 1 month. If you are not back with the pearl, I will send my fastest ship to find you. Now, go." Silas left the building and walked back into the cold night air. He needed a clever plan and a strong crew. The adventure was starting, and the clock was ticking. Silas walked through the narrow, dark streets of the harbor town. The air was cold and smelled of salt and dry fish. He stopped in front of a small, quiet house with a bright green door. This was the home of Clara. She was a doctor, but she also studied the history of the ocean. Silas knew she was the smartest person in the town. He hit the wooden door 3 times with his heavy hand. After a moment, a woman opened the door. She was tall and had sharp, clever eyes. She wore a long brown dress and held a small lamp in her hand. "Captain Silas," Clara said. She looked surprised. "It is very late. Is there a problem with your health?" "No, Clara. Silas replied. But I have a big problem. May I come in? Clara stepped back and invited him into her living room. The room was filled with tall shelves of books, glass bottles of medicine, and old maps of the stars. A small fire burned in the corner, making the room feel warm. Silas sat in a wooden chair and told Clara about his meeting with Mr. Thorn. He told her about the debt and the great pearl. Clara listened quietly. When he finished, she walked to a shelf and pulled down a very old, heavy book. She opened it to a page with a drawing of a beautiful, glowing pearl. The great pearl of the Blue Lagoon. Clara whispered. Many people think it is just a story, Silas. But I have studied the old journals of sailors. I believe it is real. The lagoon is hidden behind a wall of fog and sharp rocks. It is a very dangerous place for a ship. I have no choice. Silas said. Thorn will take the blue moon if I do not find it. I need a navigator who understands the old stories and the science of the sea. I need you, Clara. Clara looked at the fire for a long time. She was a brave woman and liked adventures. She also wanted to see the lagoon for herself to learn its secrets. I will go with you, she said firmly. I have medicines for the crew, and I can read the old maps. But we must be careful. The lagoon is not just a place of beauty. The legends say the water there is alive. Silas felt a small bit of hope in his heart. With Clara on his side, his chances were better. Thank you, Clara. We leave at midnight tomorrow. Pack your books and your medicine. I must go find the rest of my crew now. I will be ready, Clara said. She walked him to the door. But remember, Silas, the great pearl has a price. Everyone who looks for it loses something important. Silas nodded and walked back into the night. He had a navigator and a doctor. Now, he needed strong men and women to pull the ropes and sail the ship into the unknown. The next morning, Silas and Clara met at the harbor. The air was thick with the smell of wet wood and fish. They walked to the end of the long wooden pier. There she was. The Blue Moon was a beautiful ship with 3 tall masts and a dark blue hull. The white sails were tied tightly to the wooden poles. She is a fine ship, Silas, Clara said. She looked at the strong ropes and the clean deck. She is the best, Silas replied. He felt a sense of pride. But she needs food, water, and a lot of work before we sail tonight. Silas walked onto the deck. He saw his boatswain, a large man named Barnaby. Barnaby had skin like old leather and very strong arms. He was busy checking the heavy iron anchor. Barnaby, Silas called out. Gather the crew. We have a new mission. We sail for the Blue Lagoon at midnight. Barnaby stopped his work and looked at the captain. His eyes were wide. The Blue Lagoon? That is a long way, Captain. Some say the water there is cursed. We must go, Barnaby, Silas said. Mr. Thorn wants the great pearl. If we do not find it, he will take this ship. Tell the men and women. Anyone who is afraid can leave now, but those who stay will get a share of the gold. Barnaby nodded and blew a small whistle. Soon, 20 sailors gathered on the deck. They were all adults with tired but brave faces. Silas explained the plan. He introduced Clara as their doctor and navigator. No one left. They all knew Silas was a good captain, and they loved the ship. For the rest of the day, the ship was a very busy place. Sailors carried heavy wooden boxes of dried meat and bags of hard bread. They filled large barrels with fresh water from the town well. 2 men checked the cannons on the sides of the ship to make sure they were clean and ready. Clara stayed in a small room under the deck. She organized her glass bottles and her star maps. She also checked the ship's compass. Silas watched his crew work. He felt the movement of the ship on the water. It was like a living thing. As the sun began to go down, the harbor became quiet. But on the blue moon, everyone was awake. They checked the ropes one last time. They sharpened their swords and cleaned their boots. Silas stood at the back of the ship near the large wooden wheel. He looked at the town. He did not know if he would ever see it again. The stars began to appear in the dark sky. "Are we ready?" Clara asked. She stood next to him. "The ship is ready. The crew is ready," Silas said. "Now, we wait for the wind." Midnight came quickly. The moon was hidden behind a thick, grey cloud. The harbor was very dark and the water was as black as ink. Silas stood on the deck of the Blue Moon. He did not wear his bright blue coat. Instead, he wore a dark sweater so the guards could not see him. "Quietly, everyone," Silas whispered. His voice was low. "Do not light any lanterns. We must move like ghosts." The crew moved carefully across the wooden deck. They wore soft boots. Barnaby and 3 other sailors went to the front of the ship. They needed to lift the heavy iron anchor. Usually, this was a very loud job. The metal chain made a loud noise when it moved. But today, they wrapped thick pieces of old cloth around the chain. This made the sound very soft. On the dock, 2 of Mr. Thorne's guards walked past. They carried bright torches. The orange light from the fire danced on the water. Silas watched them from behind a large wooden barrel. He held his breath. If the guards saw the ship moving, they would call for help. The guards stopped for a moment. One guard looked at the blue moon. "Does that ship look different to you?" the guard asked his friend. "It is just the shadows," the other guard replied. "Come on, it is cold. Let's go back to the guardhouse." The guards walked away. Their footsteps on the wood became softer and softer. Silas waited until he could not see their torches anymore. He felt his heart beating fast in his chest. "Now!" Silas signaled to Barnaby. The sailors pulled the ropes. Slowly, the white sails opened. There was no loud sound, only the soft movement of the fabric in the wind. The wind was cold and strong. It pushed against the sails. The ship began to move away from the wooden pier. Silas could feel the ship waking up as it left the shore. Clara stood next to Silas. She looked back at the town. The lights of the houses were small and far away. "We did it," she said softly. "We are away from the harbor." "We are not safe yet," Silas said. He took the large wooden wheel in his hands. He could feel the power of the ocean now. "Thorne has many eyes. He will know we are gone by morning. We must reach the deep water before the sun rises." The ship moved faster. The water at the front of the boat made a splashing sound as it cut through the waves. The air felt different here. It was fresh and smelled of the open sea. Silas looked up at the sky. The clouds moved away, and the stars appeared. They were bright and silver. "Follow that star, Captain," Clara said, pointing to a bright light in the south. "That is our path." Silas turned the wheel. The blue moon was finally free. They were leaving their old lives behind and sailing into a world of mystery and danger. The sun rose over the vast blue horizon. The ocean was calm and flat like a mirror. After a long night of sailing, the crew was tired. Some sailors slept on the deck near the ropes. Others cleaned the wood with large brushes and buckets of seawater. Silas stood at the wheel. His eyes were red because he did not sleep, but he felt a sense of relief. They were far from the harbor now. "Captain, look there!" Barnaby called out. He was standing at the edge of the ship, pointing at the water. Silas walked over to join him. A small, dark object was floating on the surface of the sea. It moved up and down with the gentle waves. At first, Silas thought it was just a piece of wood or a tired seabird. But as the ship moved closer, The morning light hit the object. It sparkled with a bright green light. "It is a bottle," Clara said. She had come up from her cabin to breathe the fresh morning air. "Bring the net," Silas commanded. 2 sailors ran to the side of the ship. They lowered a long net into the water. They waited until the bottle floated inside. Then they pulled it up quickly. The bottle was made of thick, green glass. It was covered in small seashells and green plants. Silas took it from the net. It was heavy, and he could see a dark shape inside the glass. "There is a piece of paper," Silas observed. He sat down on a wooden box to look at it closely. The bottle was sealed with a thick piece of red wax. Silas used his small knife to cut the wax away. He pulled out a cork made of old wood. The air from inside the bottle smelled of old dust and salt. Silas reached inside with 2 fingers and pulled out a small roll of paper. It was yellow and very dry. It felt like it might turn into dust in his hands. "Be careful, Silas," Clara warned. "That paper is very old." Silas opened the paper slowly on the deck. The crew gathered around him in a circle. No one spoke. The paper was not a letter. It was a drawing. It showed a small group of islands and a hidden lagoon. In the center of the lagoon, someone had drawn a small, silver pearl with a pencil. At the bottom of the map, there were 3 words written in a language Silas did not know. "Can you read this, Clara?" Silas asked. He showed the paper to her. Clara looked at the words for a long time. She touched the paper with her finger. It is an old language from the southern islands. It says, "The heart waits." "Is this the same map Thorn showed me?" Silas asked. "No," Clara replied. "The merchant's map showed the way to the lagoon. This map shows the way inside the lagoon. Look here, Silas. There are hidden rocks and a secret path through the sharp reef. Without this paper, we would never find the pearl. We would hit the rocks and sink." Silas looked at the vast ocean. He felt a chill on his skin despite the warm sun. This was not a coincidence. Finding this bottle in the middle of the sea was a miracle. He put the paper carefully into his pocket and looked at his crew. "The journey is real," Silas said with a strong voice. "And the mystery is greater than we thought. Back to work, everyone. We have many miles to go before the sun sets." The ship arrived at the island of Salt 3 days later. From the deck, the island looked like a giant mountain of snow. Everything was bright white. The ground was not made of sand. It was made of millions of tiny crystals of salt. The sun was high in the sky, and the light reflected off the white ground. It was very bright. Silas and Clara had to protect their eyes with their hands. "Lower the small boat," Silas ordered. Barnaby and 2 other strong sailors lowered a wooden boat into the water. Silas, Clara, and Barnaby climbed inside. They rowed toward the white shore. When the boat hit the ground, Silas stepped out. His boots made a dry, crushing sound on the salt. It was like walking on dry leaves. "It is beautiful, but it is very dry," Clara said. She carried her doctor's bag and the old map. She looked at the white ground. There were no trees here. There was no green grass or cool shade. There was only white salt and large, grey rocks. They walked toward the center of the island. The air was very hot. Silas felt the salt in his throat and on his skin. He took a small drink of water from a leather bottle. They were looking for a sign from the map they found in the green bottle. "The map says there is a stone pillar," Clara said. She looked at the yellow paper carefully. "It should be near a circle of black rocks." They walked for an hour under the hot sun. Their shadows were short on the white ground. Finally, Barnaby pointed to a small hill. "Look there, Captain." On top of the hill, there was a circle of dark, black stones. In the middle of the circle stood a tall pillar. It was covered in a thick layer of white salt. It looked like a ghost standing in the sun. They ran toward it. Silas used his heavy knife to scrape the salt off the stone. It was hard work. The salt was very thick and hard. Under the salt, there were drawings on the stone. There was a drawing of a moon and a drawing of a sun. In between the moon and the sun, there was a small, round hole in the stone. "What is this?" Barnaby asked. Silas reached into the hole. His fingers touched something cold and hard. He pulled it out slowly. It was a small piece of blue glass. It was shaped like a triangle. When he held it up to the sun, the blue light fell onto the white salt. It looked like a piece of the ocean on the land. "This is the first clue," Silas said. He felt a spark of excitement. "The map says the blue glass will show us the way when the air is thick." Suddenly, they heard a loud shout from the ocean. Silas looked back at the blue moon. The crew on the ship were waving their arms and pointing at the horizon. Another ship was coming. It was far away, but it had dark red sails. "Mr. Thorne's men," Silas whispered. "They are following us. We must return to the ship now." They ran back to the small boat as fast as they could. The hunt for the pearl was now a dangerous race. The oars hit the water with a fast and heavy rhythm. Silas, Barnaby, and Clara reached the side of the blue moon in record time. Silas climbed the rope ladder first, followed quickly by the others. As soon as his boots touched the wooden deck, he looked toward the horizon. The ship with the red sails was much closer now. It was a massive vessel, larger and taller than Silas's ship. "That is the Golden Hawk," Barnaby said, his voice shaking slightly. "It is the fastest ship in Mr. Thorne's fleet. It has many cannons and a very large crew." Silas took his telescope from his belt and looked through the glass. He saw the red sails clearly. He also saw the men on the deck. They were not simple sailors. They were soldiers in red uniforms. At the front of the ship stood a man with a tall black hat. It was Captain Vane, a man known for his cruelty. "They are not here to talk," Silas said to his crew. "They want the map, and they want the pearl. Raise the anchor. Open every sail. We must move now." The crew moved with a sense of panic. They pulled the ropes with all their strength. The white sails of the blue moon caught the wind and began to pull the ship away from the island of salt. But the Golden Hawk was fast. It cut through the water like a knife. The distance between the two ships became smaller and smaller. "They are turning," Clara shouted from the back of the ship. A loud noise like a mountain breaking apart echoed across the water. A ball of heavy iron flew through the air and hit the water near the blue moon. A giant tower of white water rose into the air and fell back onto the deck. The ship shook violently, but it did not break. "They are firing their cannons," Barnaby yelled. "Captain, we must fight back." "No," Silas replied, holding the wheel tightly. "We only have 4 cannons. They have 20. If we stop to fight, we will lose. We must find a way to escape." He looked at the sky. In the distance, the blue color was turning into a dark, angry gray. Thick clouds were gathering. The wind was starting to blow harder, and the waves were growing taller. "There is a storm coming," Clara observed. Her face was pale. "If we go into that, we might sink." "It is our only hope," Silas said. "Captain Vane will not follow us into a great storm with a ship that large. He is too afraid of the rocks. We must go where they cannot follow." Another iron ball flew over the masts, tearing a small hole in the top sail. The crew screamed as the fabric ripped. Silas did not look back. He pointed the front of the ship directly toward the dark clouds. The sun disappeared behind the gray wall, and the world became cold and dark. The chase was over for a moment, but a much bigger danger was waiting for them in the heart of the sea. The sky was now completely black. Large drops of rain began to fall. They hit the wooden deck with a fast, heavy rhythm. The wind grew very cold. It moved through the ship's ropes with a terrifying force. Silas held the large wooden wheel with both hands. His muscles were tight and his face was wet with rain and salt. "Tie yourselves to the masts," Silas shouted. His voice was almost lost in the noise of the wind. "Nobody goes overboard." The ocean was no longer flat. It was a world of mountains and valleys made of dark water. One moment, the blue moon was high in the air on top of a wave. The next moment, it dropped down into a deep, dark hole. The ship shook and groaned. The wood sounded like a giant animal in pain. Barnaby and the other sailors fought with the sails. The wind wanted to steal the fabric. "Pull!" Barnaby yelled. His face was red from the effort. "We must close the sails or the wind will break the masts." Clara was below the deck at first, but she ran up when she heard a man cry out. A sailor named Thomas had fallen. He was sliding across the wet deck toward the edge of the ship. Clara grabbed a rope and wrapped it around her arm. She reached out and caught Thomas's hand just before he hit the railing. "I have you!" she cried. With the help of another sailor, she pulled Thomas to safety. His leg was hurt, but he was alive. Clara quickly tied a cloth around his wound. Even in the middle of a storm, her hands were steady. The rain was so thick that Silas could not see the front of the ship. He could only feel the power of the water against the rudder. Suddenly, a massive wall of water rose in front of them. It was twice as high as the ship's masts. It looked like a solid wall of green stone. "Hold on!" Silas screamed. The wave hit the ship with the force of a falling mountain. The sound of the water hitting the deck was like a heavy explosion. The ship tilted far to the left. For a terrifying moment, Silas thought the ship would not come back up. Water flooded the deck, washing away loose barrels and spare ropes. When the ship finally moved back to the center, Silas looked around. The deck was a mess. Barnaby was safe, but he was coughing up sea water. Clara was holding onto a wooden post, her eyes wide with fear. "Captain!" Barnaby called out. He pointed toward the back of the ship. "The rudder! The wood is breaking." Silas felt the wheel spin loosely in his hands. The ship was no longer turning. A loud cracking sound came from under the water. They were now at the mercy of the storm, floating without a way to steer. The dark waves continued to crash around them, and the island of salt was now just a distant memory. The wheel in Silas's hands felt empty. It turned easily, but the ship did not move with it. The storm was still strong, and the wind was pushing the blue moon toward the dangerous rocks. Without a rudder, the ship was like a leaf in a fast river. Silas felt a cold fear in his chest. "Barnaby, come here!" Silas shouted over the noise of the rain. Barnaby ran across the wet deck. He had to hold onto the ropes to stay on his feet. He looked at the wheel and then at Silas. "What happened, Captain?" "The connection is broken," Silas said. "The rudder is not responding. We are moving toward the white water." Barnaby looked over the back of the ship. The dark water was moving very fast. He saw the heavy piece of wood that steered the ship. It was hanging by only one thick rope. Every time a wave hit the ship, the rudder hit the hull with a heavy force. "We need to fix it now," Silas ordered. "If we hit those rocks, the ship will break into 1,000 pieces." Barnaby called 2 other strong sailors. They brought a thick coil of new rope. They had to be very careful. The back of the ship was moving up and down 5 meters with every wave. Barnaby tied a rope around his waist and gave the other end to the sailors. "I am going down," Barnaby said. His face was very serious. "It is too dangerous." Clara cried. She was standing near the cabin door. "The water will pull you under." "I have no choice, Doctor," Barnaby replied. He climbed over the railing. The cold sea water hit his legs. He held onto the wooden side of the ship with his strong fingers. The ship dropped down into a wave, and Barnaby disappeared under the white water for a second. Silas held his breath. Then, Barnaby's head appeared again. He was coughing, but he reached for the broken rudder. He used his heavy knife to cut the old, tangled ropes. Then, he grabbed the new rope. He had to wait for the right moment. When the ship moved up, he threw the rope around the rudder and pulled it tight. He did this 3 more times. His hands were blue from the cold, but he did not stop. "Pull him up," Silas commanded. The sailors pulled Barnaby back onto the deck. He was shaking and wet, but he was smiling. "The rope is tight, Captain. Try the wheel now." Silas turned the large wooden wheel. He felt a heavy resistance. The ship slowly began to turn away from the sound of the crashing waves on the rocks. They were moving in the right direction again. "Good work, Barnaby," Silas said. He looked at the horizon. The dark clouds were finally beginning to move away. A small line of orange light appeared in the east. The morning was coming, and they were still alive. However, the ship was damaged, and they needed to find land very soon. The sun was warm on Silas's back as he stood at the front of the ship. The storm was finally a memory, but the ocean was still moving with slow, heavy waves. The air felt different now. It was no longer cold and salty. It smelled of wet earth, sweet flowers, and deep forest. "Captain, look!" Clara called out. She was standing on the high deck at the back. She pointed her finger toward the south. A thin line of bright green appeared on the horizon. As the blue moon moved closer, the line grew taller and wider. It was a large island. High mountains rose into the clouds, and thick, dark green trees covered every inch of the land. At the bottom of the trees, a long beach of white sand sparkled in the sunlight. "It is beautiful," Barnaby said. He was leaning against the railing. His clothes were still wet from his brave work on the rudder. "But can we land there? The water looks shallow." Silas looked at the water. Near the beach, the color changed from dark blue to a very light, clear turquoise. He could see the yellow sand and the brown rocks under the water. "There is a small bay over there," Silas said, pointing to a curve in the shore. "The water is calm behind those rocks. We will drop the anchor there." The crew worked together to move the ship into the quiet bay. The movement of the water stopped. The ship sat still for the first time in days. Silas felt the silence of the island. There was no noise of wind or crashing waves. Instead, he heard the distant cries of colorful birds in the trees. "Barnaby, take 5 sailors," Silas ordered. "We need tall, straight trees to fix the masts and the rudder. Take the heavy axes. Clara, you come with me. We need to find fresh water. Our barrels are almost empty." They lowered the small boats and rowed to the shore. When Silas stepped onto the sand, his boots sank into the soft white surface. The heat of the island was strong. The jungle was very close to the beach. The trees were massive, with large, waxy leaves and thick vines that hung down like ropes. Clara opened her bag and took out a small glass bottle. "The plants here are very strange. Silas, I have never seen these flowers before." She pointed to a bright red flower that was the size of a dinner plate. "Stay close to me, Clara," Silas warned. He kept his hand on the handle of his sword. "This island is not on any of my usual maps. We do not know what lives in those shadows." They walked away from the beach and entered the edge of the jungle. The light became dim because the trees were so thick. It was very quiet. Suddenly, they heard a loud rustling in the bushes nearby. Silas stopped and pulled his sword from its sheath. The metal made a sharp, ringing sound. A large, yellow cat with black spots jumped across the path and disappeared into the trees. Silas breathed a sigh of relief, but he knew they had to be careful. They were no longer the masters of their world. On this island, they were only visitors. The air inside the jungle was thick and heavy. Silas and Clara walked away from the beach. The tall trees blocked the sun, so the ground was dark and cool. Silas used his sword to cut through the long, green vines. Every step was difficult. The ground was covered in wet leaves and thick roots. "Wait, Silas," Clara said. She stopped and looked at a small stream of water. The water was moving slowly over some rocks. "The water is clear. This is fresh water for the crew." Silas knelt down. He tasted the water. It was cold and sweet. "This is good. We will bring the barrels here later. But look at those rocks, Clara. They are too straight." He pointed to a wall of grey stone behind the water. It was hidden under many layers of moss and climbing plants. Clara walked closer. She used her hands to pull the green moss away. Her eyes went wide. Under the plants, there was a giant face made of stone. The face was very large, almost as tall as Silas. It was an ancient statue. It had a calm expression, with large, closed eyes and a small smile. Its ears were long, and it wore a crown made of stone flowers. The statue looked like it was sleeping in the middle of the forest. "Who built this?" Silas asked. He touched the cold stone. "I have never seen anything like this in my travels." "It is very old, Silas," Clara whispered. She was looking at the bottom of the statue. "Look here. There is writing." At the base of the stone face, there were symbols. They looked like waves, birds, and stars. Clara opened her bag and took out the blue glass triangle they found on the island of Salt. She held it up to the light that came through the trees. A small beam of blue light hit the statue's forehead. Suddenly, a small piece of stone moved. A secret door in the statue's neck opened. It was very small, only big enough for a hand. Silas reached inside. He felt a piece of cold metal. He pulled it out. It was a small silver whistle. It had the shape of a fish. On the side of the whistle, there were more symbols. Clara looked at them closely. "It says, 'Call the wind where the water falls.'" Clara translated. She looked up at the mountains. "There is a large waterfall on the other side of this hill. The map says the hidden cave is behind it. This whistle is the key to entering the cave." Silas put the whistle into his pocket. He felt a mix of excitement and worry. The merchant ship is still out there. We must move fast. Let's get the water and tell the crew. We have a long climb ahead of us. They turned back toward the beach. The silent stone face watched them go. Silas felt like the island was full of eyes, watching every move they made. The mystery was growing deeper, and the great pearl was waiting somewhere in the dark heart of the island. The climb was very difficult. The mountainside was steep and the ground was slippery with wet mud and loose rocks. Silas led the way, followed by Clara and Barnaby. Behind them, several sailors carried lamps and ropes. The air grew louder as they climbed higher. It was the sound of falling water. "We are close," Silas shouted over the noise. They turned a corner around a large grey cliff. In front of them was a massive waterfall. The water fell from a high peak, crashing into a deep blue pool at the bottom. A white mist filled the air, and the sunlight created a beautiful rainbow in the spray. The water hit the rocks with a force that made the ground shake under their boots. Clara looked at the old map and then at the silver whistle in Silas's hand. The message said to call the wind here. She said. She pointed to a flat rock near the edge of the falling water. "Stand there, Silas." Silas walked to the flat rock. The cold mist from the waterfall soaked his clothes in seconds. He took the silver whistle and held it to his lips. He blew into it with all his breath. A high, clear note filled the air. It was a beautiful sound that seemed to cut through the heavy noise of the water. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the wind began to change. It started to blow in a circle, pushing the heavy wall of water to the left. A small opening appeared in the rock behind the waterfall. It was dark and narrow, but it was big enough for a man to enter. "There it is!" Barnaby cried. He ran toward the opening, but Silas stopped him. "Wait, Barnaby. We must be careful," Silas warned. "Light the lamps." The sailors lit 3 oil lamps. The yellow light pushed back the shadows. Silas entered the opening first. The air inside was very different from the jungle. It was cold and smelled of damp stone and ancient dust. The walls were wet, and small drops of water fell from the ceiling, hitting the floor. The path led deep into the heart of the mountain. The ground was flat but very smooth. As they walked, the light from their lamps reflected off the walls. Silas saw that the walls were not natural. They were covered in drawings of stars, moons, and the ocean. This cave was built by people a long time ago. Clara whispered. She touched a drawing of a large ship. They were sailors, just like us. They walked for a long time until the tunnel opened into a very large room. The ceiling was so high that their lamps could not show the top. In the center of the room, there was a small stone table. On the table sat a single object that caught the light of their lamps. It was a large golden coin, resting on a velvet cushion that was now only grey dust. "We found it," Barnaby said in a quiet voice. Silas walked toward the table. He knew this was only the beginning of the mystery, but the cave was silent and heavy with the secrets of the past. Silas walked slowly toward the stone table in the center of the large cave. The air was very still. The yellow light from the sailors' lamps made long shadows on the walls. He reached out his hand. His fingers touched the cold, heavy metal of the coin. It was much larger than a regular coin. It was the size of a man's palm and very thick. "Be careful, Silas," Clara whispered. She stepped closer to see the object. Silas lifted the coin from the stone table. It was made of bright, yellow gold. On one side, there was a beautiful carving of a smiling sun with many long rays. In the very center of the sun, there was a small needle made of dark silver. The needle moved freely behind a thin piece of clear glass. "It looks like a compass," Barnaby said, looking over Silas's shoulder. "But it is not pointing north. Look, the needle is pointing toward the solid rock wall." Clara took her own small compass from her pocket. She compared the two. "Barnaby is right. My compass points north, but this golden coin is pointing in a different direction. It is pointing toward the position of the sun outside the mountain." She took the coin from Silas and moved it around. No matter how she turned her hand, the dark silver needle always stayed pointed toward the sun. "This is a sun compass," Clara explained. "The old stories say the people of the islands used the sun to find their way through the thickest fog. This coin does not care about the North Pole. It only cares about the light." "How does that help us find the Great Pearl?" Barnaby asked. He looked disappointed. Silas took the coin back and looked at the map in his other hand. "The map says the Blue Lagoon is hidden by a wall of mist that never moves. In that mist, a regular compass will spin in circles. We will be lost. But with this, we can follow the sun even when we cannot see the sky." Suddenly, the ground under their boots began to shake. A low, heavy sound came from the tunnel. It was the sound of the waterfall moving back to its original place. The wind from the silver whistle was stopping. "The door is closing," Silas shouted. "We must leave now, or we will be trapped in the dark forever." The crew ran back into the narrow tunnel. Silas held the golden coin tightly in his hand. They moved as fast as they could. The light from their lamps bounced wildly on the wet walls. They reached the opening just as the heavy wall of water began to slide back across the rock. One by one, they jumped through the falling water and landed on the wet rocks outside. They were soaked and cold, but they were safe. Silas looked at the golden coin in the daylight. The needle was steady. It was pointing directly toward the south, where the great pearl waited for them. The crew returned to the blue moon as the sun began to set. Everyone was tired, but they felt successful. They had fresh water, new wood for the ship, and the mysterious golden coin. Silas put the coin and the old map in a small wooden box in his cabin. He locked the door and went to the deck to help Barnaby with the repairs. The night was very quiet. The only sound was the gentle movement of the water against the side of the ship. Most of the sailors were sleeping in their hammocks. Silas sat on a wooden bench, looking at the stars. He felt a sense of peace, but it did not last long. He heard a very soft sound coming from the direction of his cabin. It was not the sound of the wind. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock. Silas stood up quickly. He did not make a noise. He moved toward his cabin like a cat in the dark. He saw a shadow moving near his door. The person was tall and wore a dark coat. The door to the cabin was open. Silas waited until the person came out. The stranger was holding the wooden box under his arm. "Stop right there," Silas said. His voice was cold and hard. The person jumped in surprise. He tried to run toward the side of the ship, but Silas was faster. He grabbed the man's arm and pulled him into the light of a nearby lantern. It was Marcus, one of the oldest sailors on the ship. Marcus was usually a quiet man, but now his face was full of fear. "Marcus?" Silas asked. He was shocked. "What are you doing with that box?" "I am sorry, Captain," Marcus whispered. He looked down at his boots. "I have a family in the city. We are very poor. Mr. Thorne came to me before we left. He gave me 10 silver coins. He promised me 1,000 more if I brought him the map and the coin." Barnaby and Clara heard the voices and came onto the deck. Soon, the whole crew was awake. They gathered around Marcus. Some of the sailors looked very angry. They felt betrayed by their friend. "You were going to leave us?" Barnaby asked. He stepped toward Marcus with his large fists closed. "You were going to give our secrets to that mean merchant. He has a faster ship." Marcus cried. "He will find us anyway. I just wanted to save myself." Silas took the wooden box back. He looked at Marcus for a long time. He felt a deep sadness. He trusted every man and woman on his ship. Now, that trust was broken. "Where is the signal, Marcus?" Silas asked. "How are you going to tell Thorne where we are?" Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, round mirror. "I was going to use the moon to signal the Golden Hawk. They are waiting just past the horizon." Silas looked out at the dark ocean. Somewhere out there, Captain Vane was watching and waiting. The danger was not just from the sea or the islands. The danger was now inside the ship. "Tie his hands, Barnaby," Silas ordered. "Put him in the small room under the deck. We will decide his fate in the morning." As the sailors led Marcus away, Silas looked at Clara. Her face was very serious. "We cannot stay here, Silas," she said. "If Thorne's ship is close, they will see us at sunrise. We must leave this island tonight." The sun rose slowly over the green mountains of the island. The sky was a soft pink and gold. On the deck of the Blue Moon, the crew was very quiet. They stood in a large circle. In the middle of the circle, Marcus sat on a wooden crate. His hands were tied with a thick rope. He looked at his boots and did not speak. Silas walked into the center of the circle. He looked at Marcus for a long time. Silas was not angry. He was sad. He had known Marcus for many years. They had survived many storms together. "The crew is waiting, Captain," Barnaby said. He held a heavy wooden stick in his hand. "The law of the sea is very clear. A traitor must be punished. Some men want to throw him into the ocean." A few sailors nodded their heads. "He tried to sell us to Thorn." One woman shouted. "He put our lives in danger." Silas raised his hand. The sailors became silent. Marcus made a very bad choice, Silas said. His voice was deep and steady. "He forgot that we are a family. But I am not a killer. I will not throw a man into the sea to die." Clara stood next to Silas. She looked at Marcus with pity. "He has a family, Silas." He was afraid and hungry for gold. Fear makes people do terrible things. Silas turned to Marcus. "Marcus, look at me." Marcus raised his head. His eyes were wet with tears. "I am so sorry, Silas. I was a fool. You cannot stay on this ship," Silas said. "The crew does not trust you. If you stay, there will be more trouble. But I will not leave you with nothing. We are on a beautiful island. There is fresh water in the stream. There is fruit in the trees and fish in the bay." Silas looked at Barnaby. "Put Marcus in the small boat. Give him a tent, a fishing line, a knife, and a bag of dried meat. We will leave him here on the beach." "You are marooning him?" Barnaby asked. "I am giving him a chance to live," Silas replied. "When we return with the Great Pearl, we will pass this island again. If he is still here, and if he is still sorry, we will think about taking him home. But for now, his journey with the Blue Moon is over." The sailors helped Marcus into the small boat. They put the supplies inside. Marcus did not fight. He stepped onto the white sand of the beach and watched as the sailors rowed back to the ship. He looked very small against the giant green jungle. Silas stood at the back of the ship and watched the island. He felt the weight of his decision. Being a captain was not always about fighting enemies. Sometimes, it was about making hard choices for the good of everyone. "Raise the anchor," Silas commanded. "We must leave before the sun is high. The Golden Hawk is coming, and we have a pearl to find." The ship began to move. The white beach grew smaller and smaller until Marcus was only a tiny dark dot on the sand. Silas turned his back to the island and looked toward the open sea. The wind was strong as the blue moon sailed away from the jungle island. Silas stood at the wheel, but his mind was not at peace. He looked back at the green mountains one last time. He hoped Marcus would find enough food to survive. The crew was busy on the deck. They were moving faster now because they knew the danger was close. "Captain, look to the north," a sailor shouted from the top of the mast. Silas took his telescope. He looked through the glass and felt a cold shiver. On the horizon, two large red sails were cutting through the blue water. It was the Golden Hawk. It was moving very fast. Mr. Thorne's ship had found them again. "They are following our path exactly," Clara said. She stood next to Silas, her face pale. "Marcus must have given them a very good signal before we caught him." "They have the wind behind them," Barnaby said. He looked at the distance between the two ships. "They will be next to us in less than an hour. Captain, what do we do? We cannot outrun them in the open sea." Silas looked at the sun. Then, he looked at the golden coin in his pocket. The needle was pointing toward a part of the ocean where the air looked different. In the distance, a wall of thick, white mist sat on top of the water. It did not move. It looked like a solid white mountain. "That is the path to the Blue Lagoon," Silas said. He pointed toward the mist. "If we go in there, they will lose us." "But Silas," Clara warned, "the legends say the mist is full of sharp rocks. No ship comes out of that fog." "We have the sun compass now," Silas replied. "It will guide us. Captain Vane does not have one. He will have to stop at the edge of the fog or risk breaking his ship." Suddenly, a heavy sound filled the air. A large iron ball hit the water 50 meters behind the blue moon. A tall pillar of white spray rose into the air. A second later, another sound followed. This time, the iron ball flew over the ship's masts, tearing a small piece of the white sail. "They are getting closer," Barnaby yelled. "They are trying to break our masts." "Hold the line," Silas commanded. "Do not fire back. We need all our speed. Barnaby, tell the sailors to move to the front of the ship. We need to push the nose down to go faster." The Golden Hawk was now close enough that Silas could see the soldiers on the deck. They were preparing their cannons for a full attack. Captain Vane stood at the front of the enemy ship. He raised his sword and pointed it at Silas. It was a silent promise of a fight. The white mist was getting closer. It was like a giant mouth waiting to swallow them. Silas held the wheel with all his strength. The air began to turn cold and damp. The bright sunlight started to fade. "Get ready," Silas shouted. "We are going into the fog." One last cannonball hit the water near the ship, and then the world went white. The sun, the enemy ship, and the ocean disappeared. The blue moon entered the thick mist, and everything became very quiet. The mist was like a thick, wet blanket. Silas could not see the front of his own ship. The world was silent and white. The blue moon moved very slowly through the water. Silas knew that Captain Vane and the Golden Hawk were waiting at the edge of the fog. They were like wolves waiting for a rabbit to come out of a hole. The enemy will not enter the mist. Silas whispered to Clara. They stood near the back of the ship. "But they will wait there for days. We need to know their plan. Do they have more ships coming? Do they have a way to track us in the dark? What are you thinking, Silas?" Clara asked. Her voice was very low. "I'm going back," Silas said. "Just for a moment. I will take the small rowboat. I want to see what is happening on the deck of the Golden Hawk." "I am coming with you," Clara said firmly. "You need someone to watch the water while you climb. And I can read any papers you find. My eyes are very good in the dark." Silas did not want to put Clara in danger, but he knew she was right. They told Barnaby to keep the ship quiet and wait for their return. Silas and Clara lowered a small, dark rowboat into the water. They did not use the oars. Instead, they used their hands to push the boat silently through the mist. After 20 minutes, the mist began to turn thin. Silas saw a glow of orange light. It was the lanterns of the Golden Hawk. The large ship was sitting still at the edge of the white wall. Silas pushed the small boat against the dark wooden side of the enemy vessel. He found a thick rope hanging over the edge. "Stay here," Silas whispered to Clara. He climbed the rope with the skill of a cat. He reached the top and looked over the railing. The enemy sailors were busy. Some were cleaning their guns, and others were drinking from large metal cups. Silas moved into the shadows. He walked toward the large cabin at the back of the ship. Through a small glass window, he saw Captain Vane. The captain was talking to a tall man in a fine suit. It was a messenger from Mr. Thorne. "The Great Pearl is not the only thing," the messenger said. Silas pressed his ear to the wood. Mr. Thorne wants the map because it shows the location of the Sun Temple. The pearl is the key to the temple's door. Silas felt his heart jump. The story was bigger than he thought. He saw a large piece of paper on the table. It was a list of all the ships Mr. Thorne owned. There were 5 more ships coming to help Captain Vane. Suddenly, a heavy boot hit the deck behind Silas. A guard was walking toward the cabin. Silas did not have time to hide. He jumped over the railing and dropped into the dark water. He hit the surface with a soft splash. He swam to the small boat where Clara was waiting. "Start rowing," Silas whispered. "We have to go. There are more ships coming, and the pearl is a key." They moved back into the thick white mist just as the guard looked over the side of the ship. The night raid was over, but the secret they found changed everything. They were no longer just looking for a treasure. They were in the middle of a great mystery. Silas and Clara reached the side of the blue moon. The thick white mist was still all around them. They climbed the rope ladder quickly. Their hands were cold and wet from the sea. Barnaby was waiting for them near the railing. He looked worried. "Captain, you are back," Barnaby whispered. "Did you find anything?" "Yes," Silas said. He was breathing fast. "Thorne is sending 5 more ships, and the Great Pearl is a key to a Sun Temple. I must check the map again. I need to see if the temple is marked on it." Silas ran toward his cabin. Clara and Barnaby followed him. Silas reached the wooden door and stopped. He felt a cold wind on his neck. The door was not closed. It was moving slowly back and forth. The lock was broken. "I locked this door before we left," Silas said. His voice was full of fear. He stepped into the room. The cabin was a mess. Books were on the floor. His chair was turned over. Silas looked at the small table where he kept the wooden box. The table was empty. The box with the map and the golden coin was gone. "It is not here," Silas whispered. He searched under the bed and behind the curtains. "The map is stolen. The sun compass is gone too." "How?" Clara asked. She looked around the room. "We were only gone for an hour, and we marooned Marcus on the island. There are no other traitors here." Barnaby looked at the window of the cabin. It was a small square of glass. One of the glass pieces was broken. On the sharp edge of the wood, there was a small piece of red silk. "Look at this," Barnaby said. He picked up the red fabric. "This is not from our crew. We do not wear silk. This is from a soldier's uniform. Someone from the Golden Hawk followed us." Silas realized. When we were on their ship, one of their men was already on our ship. They used the mist to hide. They are very clever. If they have the map and the compass, they will find the Sun Temple before us, Clara said. Her eyes were wide with worry. "We are lost in this mist without the sun compass. We cannot see the sun or the stars." Silas sat down on his bed. He put his head in his hands. He felt like he was losing the battle. Mr. Thorne had more ships, more men, and now he had the map. But then, Silas looked at Clara. He remembered something. "Clara," Silas said, "you studied the map for hours. You are a doctor and a navigator. Do you remember the drawings? Can you draw it again?" Clara closed her eyes. She thought about the yellow paper. She thought about the lines, the islands, and the symbols. "I remember the shapes," she said slowly. "I remember the path through the rocks. It is not perfect, but I can try." "Then we are not defeated yet," Silas said. He stood up and his eyes were bright again. "Barnaby, tell the crew to stay quiet. We are going to sail through this mist using only our memory. We must find the Sun Temple before Captain Vane reaches the shore. The mist was still very thick around the blue moon. For many hours, the ship did not move. Silas stood on the deck, feeling the cold water on his face. Without the sun compass, he felt like a blind man in a dark room. The crew was silent. They were waiting for a miracle. "The sun is gone," Silas said to Clara. "The mist is too high. We cannot see the horizon. How can we find the temple now?" Clara was sitting on a wooden crate. She had a small lamp and a new piece of paper. She was drawing lines and dots. The map showed a path through the rocks. She said, "But the path follows the position of the stars at night. In this part of the world, the stars are different." As the evening came, something strange happened. The mist stayed thick near the water, but it began to disappear from the sky above them. It was like standing in a deep bowl of milk while looking at a clear, dark ceiling. One by one, small silver lights appeared. "The stars!" Barnaby shouted. He pointed at the sky. "Quiet, Barnaby," Silas reminded him. "We do not want the enemy to hear us." Clara stood up. She took a metal tool from her bag. It was a sextant, a tool used to measure the distance between the stars and the water. She looked through the small glass lens. She looked at a very bright star in the south. "That is the southern eye," Clara whispered. The old map had a drawing of that star. It said we must keep that star on our left side to find the secret path. "Are you sure, Clara?" Silas asked. "The rocks here are very sharp. If we make one mistake, the ship will sink in minutes." "I am sure, Silas," Clara replied. Her voice was strong and calm. "I remember the drawing perfectly. The southern eye leads to the Gate of Gold." Silas turned the large wooden wheel. The ship began to move slowly through the white fog. The only sound was the water hitting the side of the boat. It was a soft, splashing sound. Every few minutes, Clara looked up at the stars and told Silas to turn the wheel a little bit to the left or the right. Suddenly, the ship made a low, scraping sound. Everyone stopped breathing. Silas felt the ship shake. Had they hit a rock? "Stop," Barnaby whispered. Silas looked over the side. A large, black rock was only centimeters away from the ship's hull. It looked like a giant tooth coming out of the water. They were in the middle of a field of hidden rocks. "Do not stop, Silas," Clara said softly. "The path is narrow. Move forward very slowly." Silas pushed the wheel. The ship moved past the rock. They saw more rocks appearing in the mist, but Clara's directions were perfect. She guided the ship like a thread through a needle. For 3 hours, they traveled through the dangerous water. Finally, the mist began to turn thin. Silas saw a dark shape in front of them. It was not a rock. It was a tall, dark mountain. At the bottom of the mountain, there was a small light. It was not a fire. It was the reflection of the moon on a stone wall. "We are here," Clara said. "The hidden lagoon." The mist disappeared completely as the blue moon moved into the quiet water. The lagoon was like a secret world. High cliffs of dark, red stone surrounded the water on all sides. These cliffs were so tall that they blocked the wind. The water was not blue anymore. It was a bright, glowing green. It was so clear that Silas could see colorful fish and white shells deep under the ship. "It is the Blue Lagoon," Clara whispered. She was amazed by the beauty of the place. The old stories were true. It is the most beautiful place on earth. "And the most hidden," Silas added. He looked toward the shore. There was a small beach with golden sand. Behind the sand, he saw the ruins of an ancient city. The stone buildings were broken and covered in thick green plants and bright flowers. It was a silent, empty place. Silas, Clara, and Barnaby took the small rowboat to the shore. When the boat touched the beach, they stepped out onto the warm sand. They walked toward the center of the ruins. Silas looked at every stone carefully. In the middle of the broken houses, they found a large statue. It was a giant stone hand pointing toward a high mountain. "Clara, do you remember the drawing?" Silas asked. "Yes," Clara replied. "The map said the key is at the end of the finger's shadow." She looked at the sun. It was high in the sky. The shadow of the stone hand was long and dark. It pointed toward a very large, flat rock near a small, bubbling stream. They walked to the rock. It was covered in grey moss. Silas tried to move it, but it was too heavy for one man. "Barnaby, I need your strength," Silas said. Barnaby stepped forward. He put his large, strong hands under the edge of the stone. He breathed deeply and pulled up with all his power. The rock moved slowly. Under the rock, there was a small hole in the dry earth. Inside the hole was a box made of dark, heavy wood. It was not locked. Silas opened the lid carefully. Inside, resting on a piece of old blue silk, was a massive key. It was made of solid gold. The top of the key was shaped like a rising sun, and a small, white pearl sat in the center of the metal. "This is it," Silas said. He lifted the key. It was very heavy and sparkled brightly in the sunlight. "This is the golden key to the Sun Temple." "But where is the temple, Captain?" Barnaby asked, looking around the empty ruins. Silas looked up at the high mountain. At the very top, he saw a building made of white stone and gold. It was shining so brightly that it looked like a second sun in the sky. "It is there," Silas said, pointing to the peak. "But we must be fast. We are not alone anymore." He looked back at the narrow entrance of the lagoon. The white mist was moving. A ship with tall, dark red sails was slowly appearing. The Golden Hawk had survived the rocks and the fog. Captain Vane was here. The red sails of the Golden Hawk were getting closer every minute. Silas looked at the golden key in his hand and then at the dark mountain. He knew they could not stay on the open beach. If Captain Vane landed his soldiers now, Silas and his friends would be caught. "Into the trees!" Silas shouted. "We must find a place to hide before they see us." Silas, Clara, and Barnaby ran away from the golden sand and entered the thick green jungle. The air was hot and full of the smell of sweet flowers. They followed a narrow path that moved away from the ruins. Behind them, they heard the heavy action of a cannon firing from the enemy ship. A ball of iron hit the water. "They are firing at our ship," Barnaby said. He looked back with worry. "Our crew knows what to do," Silas replied. "They will hide the blue moon in the shadows of the cliffs. We must focus on the key." They walked for 20 minutes. Suddenly, the jungle opened up into a beautiful green valley. In the middle of the valley, there was a small village. The houses were made of dark wood and had roofs made of large, dry leaves. There were gardens full of strange blue fruits and orange vegetables. A group of people stood in the center of the village. They were all adults with tan skin and simple clothes made of woven grass. They did not have guns or swords. Instead, they held long wooden poles. They looked at Silas and his friends with surprise and fear. "We are not here to fight," Silas said. He put his sword on the ground to show he was peaceful. He held up his hands. "We are sailors. We come in peace." The villagers did not move. Then, a tall woman stepped forward. She had long black hair and a necklace made of white shells. She looked at the golden key in Silas's hand. Her eyes went wide with shock. "The Sun Key," she whispered in a language that was very old but clear. "No one has held that key for 100 years. You know this object?" Clara asked. She stepped closer, her doctor's bag over her shoulder. We found it under a stone in the ruins. It is the key to the mountain, the woman said. She pointed to the white temple at the peak. But it is only the first part. The mountain does not open for one key alone. There are 3 secrets in the lagoon. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed from the beach. It was the sound of many men shouting and the rhythm of heavy boots on the sand. Captain Vane's soldiers had landed. The villagers looked toward the forest with fear. The men in red are here, Silas warned. They are mean men. They want the key and the temple. The woman looked at Silas. She saw the honesty in his eyes. Follow me, she said. The village is hidden from the beach, but we must take you to the elder. He knows the way of the 3 keys. If the men in red find the temple first, the sun will go dark for us all. Silas felt the weight of the situation. He was not just a pirate looking for a debt anymore. He was the protector of an ancient secret. They followed the woman into a large house at the edge of the village, leaving the sounds of the enemy behind them. The inside of the elder's house was cool and dark. The walls were decorated with colorful woven rugs and dried flowers. An old man sat on a high chair made of polished wood. His hair was white and his skin was wrinkled like a dry leaf. This was Kalen, the leader of the village. He looked at Silas with eyes that were very old but very bright. You have the golden key, Kalen said slowly. That is a heavy weight to carry, Captain. Before Silas could answer, the door of the house opened. A sailor named Tom ran inside. He was breathing very fast, and his face was covered in sweat. He looked at Silas with a worried expression. Captain, Tom said, I have bad news from the ship. Barnaby and the others are worried. We checked the supplies this morning. The storm at the island of Salt destroyed 3 of our large food barrels. The bread is wet and green with mold. We only have enough dried meat for 2 more days. Silas felt a new weight in his chest. A hungry crew was a dangerous crew. If the sailors did not eat, they would lose their strength. They would not be able to pull the ropes or fight the soldiers. Can we not fish in the lagoon? Clara asked the villager woman, Luma. No, Luma replied. The red-sailed ship is sitting at the mouth of the lagoon. Their small boats are everywhere in the water. If your sailors go out to fish, the enemy will see them and capture them. You are trapped between the mountains and the sea. Silas looked at the elder. We need food, Kalen. My men and women are brave, but they cannot live on hope alone. If we do not find the pearl soon, we will all be too weak to leave. Kalen nodded. He waved his hand, and 2 villagers brought in a large wooden tray. On the tray, there were small blue fruits, yellow roots, and some dried fish. This is all we can give you today, Kalen said. Our gardens are small, and the land is dry this year. But it will help for 1 night. To find more, you must reach the Sun Temple. The legends say the temple was built by a king who never went hungry. There are secrets there that can save your people. Silas took a piece of the blue fruit. It was sweet and cold. Thank you, Kalen. But we only have 1 key. You said there are 3. Yes, the elder said. The golden key opens the outer gate. But to find the Great Pearl, you also need the silver key from the Cave of Ice and the iron key from the Forest of Thorns. Without all 3, the temple will remain a tomb. Silas looked at Tom. Take this tray back to the ship. Divide it equally among the crew. Tell them I am working on a plan. We will not starve. Tom took the food and hurried back toward the beach. Silas turned back to the elder. The hunger was a ticking clock. They had to find the remaining keys before the last piece of dried meat was gone. The mystery of the lagoon was now a fight for survival. Silas and Clara left the village of Elder Kalen. They walked back through the thick green jungle toward the hidden bay. The air was very hot, and the smell of the forest was strong. When they reached the white sand of the beach, they saw the blue moon. The ship was hiding in the deep shadows of the tall red cliffs. They rowed the small boat back to the ship. On the deck, the crew looked tired. Their faces were thin because they did not have enough food. Barnaby was standing near the front of the ship. He was looking at the clear green water of the lagoon. "The food from the village helped, Captain," Barnaby said. "But the men are still weak. They need a sign that we will find the pearl." Suddenly, the water near the ship began to move in a strange way. Large bubbles appeared on the surface. A massive shape moved under the water. It was long and dark, and it was much larger than the blue moon. The ship began to rock back and forth. "Is it a monster?" Clara asked. She held onto the wooden railing tightly. A giant head rose slowly out of the water. It was a whale, but Silas had never seen one like this. The skin of the whale was not blue or black. It was a beautiful, shining silver. It had small, kind eyes the color of the sea. The whale stayed next to the ship and did not move. It let out a long, heavy breath. A fountain of water rose high into the air and fell back onto the deck like a gentle rain. "It is the great white whale," Barnaby whispered. He took off his hat and held it against his chest. The old sailors speak of this creature. They say it is the protector of the lagoon. It only appears to those who have a good heart. The sailors gathered at the side of the ship. They were silent. They forgot their hunger for a moment. They felt a strange sense of peace. The whale swam in a slow circle around the ship. It hit the water gently with its massive tail. The sound was like a heavy drum, but it was not scary. "It is not a monster," Silas said. "It is a friend. Look, it is moving toward the north of the lagoon." The whale began to swim away slowly. It stopped every few minutes and looked back at the ship. It seemed to be waiting for them. Silas looked at the golden key in his pocket and then at the whale. "The elder said the silver key is in a cave of ice," Silas remembered. "The water to the north is very cold. I think the whale is showing us the way." "We must follow it, Silas," Clara said. "The wind is moving in that direction now. It is a sign of luck." Silas turned to his crew. "Raise the sails. We follow the great whale. This is our path to the second key." The sailors moved with new energy. They were no longer just hungry men. They were explorers again. The silver whale led the ship through the quiet water, moving away from the hot jungle and toward the white, frozen peaks of the northern mountains. The air grew very cold as the blue moon sailed further north. The great whale continued to lead the way. It moved through the water with a quiet grace. Soon, the green trees of the jungle disappeared. In their place, tall mountains of white ice rose out of the green lagoon. The water here was filled with small, floating pieces of ice that looked like diamonds in the sun. "I never thought a tropical lagoon could have ice," Clara said. She wore her thickest brown coat and a wool hat. The temperature must be very low because of the height of these mountains. The whale stopped in front of a giant cliff of blue ice. It hit the water 3 times with its tail and then dove deep into the dark sea. Silas knew this was their destination. He looked at the cliff and saw a small, dark opening at the water level. It was a cave made entirely of frozen water. "Lower the rowboat," Silas ordered. "Barnaby, stay with the ship. Keep the sailors warm and watch for Captain Vane. Clara and I will enter the cave." Silas and Clara rowed the small boat into the opening. Inside, the world was a beautiful shade of bright blue. The walls were smooth and clear like glass. Large icicles hung from the ceiling like frozen swords. The only sound was the soft splashing of their oars in the cold water. "Look at the floor of the cave," Clara whispered. Deep under the clear water, they saw something glowing. It was a soft, silver light. Silas stopped the boat. He took a long wooden pole with a metal hook at the end. He pushed the pole into the water. It was very deep and the water was freezing. He felt the hook touch something solid. "I have it," Silas said. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. He pulled the pole up slowly. At the end of the hook was a small chest made of silver. It was covered in a thin layer of ice. Silas put the chest on the floor of the boat. He used his knife to break the ice. The metal was very cold, and it made his fingers feel numb. When he opened the lid, a bright silver light filled the cave. Inside was the silver key. It was shaped like a crescent moon. The metal was cool and smooth, and it had small blue stones that looked like frozen tears. "The second key," Clara said, her eyes shining with excitement. "The elder was right. The silver key belongs to the moon and the ice." Silas held the key tightly. "We have the gold key and the silver key. Now we only need the iron key. But the air is changing, Clara. I feel a movement in the water." As they rowed out of the cave, they saw the blue moon in the distance. But something was wrong. A second ship was visible near the edge of the ice. It was the Golden Hawk. Captain Vane had found a way through the mist, and he was not far away. The race for the final key was becoming more dangerous every second. Silas and Clara climbed back onto the deck of the Blue Moon. The cold wind from the ice mountains was still biting, but there was no time to rest. Silas looked through his telescope. The Golden Hawk was moving fast. Captain Vane was using his larger sails to catch every bit of wind. "We cannot go back the way we came," Silas said to Barnaby. "Vane will block us. We must head toward the center of the island." The elder said the iron key is in the Forest of Thorns. Barnaby looked at the map. "The Forest of Thorns is a dark place, Captain. The villagers say the plants there have teeth. Even the animals are afraid to go inside." "We have no choice," Silas replied. "We have the gold key and the silver key. Without the iron key, we cannot enter the temple." They sailed away from the ice and toward a dark, dense part of the island. As they approached the shore, the bright green jungle disappeared. In its place stood a forest of tall, black trees. These trees did not have leaves. Instead, they were covered in long, sharp thorns that looked like iron needles. The ground was gray and dusty. Silas, Clara, and two strong sailors named Miller and Sarah rowed to the shore. They wore heavy leather gloves and thick boots to protect themselves. As soon as they stepped into the forest, the air felt heavy and hot. The thorns were everywhere. They grew across the paths and hung from the branches like dangerous nets. "Watch your step," Silas warned. He used his heavy sword to cut a path through the thorns. Each time his blade hit a branch, it made a dry, scraping sound. They walked deeper into the dark forest. The light of the sun could not reach the ground. After an hour, they reached a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing stood an old, rusted cage made of heavy iron bars. Inside the cage, resting on a stone pillar, was the iron key. The key was simple and heavy. It did not glow like the silver or gold keys. It looked like it was made of the earth itself. Silas reached his hand through the bars of the cage, but the space was too small. "There is a lock on the cage door," Clara observed. She looked at the keyhole. "But we do not have a key for this cage." Sarah, the sailor, stepped forward. She was a very clever woman who knew how to fix many things. "I do not need a key, Captain," she said. She took a small metal tool from her belt. She worked quietly for several minutes. Finally, a loud click echoed through the silent forest. The cage door swung open. Silas took the iron key. It was cold and felt very heavy in his hand. "We have all three," he said. He felt a moment of victory, but then he heard a sound that made his blood turn cold. A loud gunshot echoed from the beach. Then another. Vane's men. Miller shouted, "They have reached our ship." Silas put the iron key in his bag. "Run," he commanded. "We must get back to the water now." They turned and ran back through the path they had cut. The thorns scratched at their clothes, but they did not stop. The final battle for the Great Pearl was about to begin. The trip back through the forest of thorns felt twice as long. Silas's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every gunshot that echoed from the beach felt like a strike against his own ship. They burst from the dark, jagged trees and onto the sand, squinting as the bright tropical sun hit their eyes. The scene at the lagoon was chaos. The blue moon was anchored close to the cliffs, her cannons barking white smoke into the air. Two of Captain Vane's longboats were swarming the side of the ship, filled with soldiers in red uniforms. Men were climbing the ropes, and the sound of clashing steel carried over the water. "They are boarding her," Miller cried, reaching for his pistol. "We can't get to the ship," Silas said, his eyes scanning the shoreline. "Look there." A third longboat was pulling onto the sand just 50 yards away. At the front stood Captain Vane himself. He stepped into the shallow water, his silver-handled sword already drawn. Behind him, 10 soldiers marched with muskets ready. Vane wasn't looking at the ship. He was looking at the path to the mountain. He knew the keys were on the shore. "We have to reach the temple before he pins us against the cliffs," Silas whispered. "Captain." Barnaby's voice boomed from the deck of the Blue Moon. He had spotted them. He pointed toward a small, narrow path that wound up the side of the red cliffs. "Go. We'll hold them off." Silas made a split-second choice. He couldn't help his ship from the sand, but he could finish the mission they had all bled for. "Clara, Miller, Sarah, to the cliffs. Move." They ran. The sand was heavy under their boots, making every step a struggle. Captain Vane saw them and let out a roar of command. "Stop them. I want those keys." The red-coated soldiers raised their muskets. Bullets hissed through the air, kicking up plumes of sand around Silas's feet. One bullet tore through the sleeve of Miller's coat, but the sailor didn't stop. They reached the base of the path, a steep, rocky trail that looked more like a ladder than a road. Silas turned for 1 second. He saw Barnaby on the deck of the Blue Moon, swinging a heavy boarding axe to push a redcoat back into the sea. His crew was fighting like lions. "Up," Silas urged. As they climbed, the lagoon opened up below them. They could see the entire battle, the smoke, the bright red sails of the Golden Hawk waiting at the mouth of the lagoon, and the silver whale's tail splashing in the distance. They were halfway up the cliff when a shadow fell over them. Silas looked up. The White Sun Temple sat directly above, glowing with a light that seemed to come from inside the stone itself. But the path ahead was blocked by a massive stone gate with 3 distinct shapes carved into the rock: a circle, a crescent, and a square. "The locks," Clara gasped, her face flushed from the climb. Silas reached into his bag. He felt the weight of the gold, the silver, and the iron. "We're here. Now let's hope the legends were right about how to use them." The stone gate was massive, carved directly into the heart of the Red Mountain. It didn't look like a door. It looked like a wall of solid rock that had been polished until it shone like a mirror. In the center of the wall, 3 deep indentations waited. "Vane is nearly at the base of the trail," Miller shouted, looking over the edge. Below, the red-coated soldiers were scrambling up the rocks, their bayonets glinting in the sun. Captain Vane was leading them, his face twisted in a mask of greedy determination. "We have to be fast," Silas said, his voice tight. He pulled the 3 keys from his bag and laid them on a flat stone. The air around the gate felt charged, as if a storm were about to break. Silas looked at the shapes on the door. The circle, representing the sun and the gold key. The crescent, representing the moon and the silver key. The square, representing the earth and the iron key. "Clara, take the silver. Miller, the iron. We must turn them at the exact same time." Silas commanded. They stepped forward. The heat radiating from the stone was intense. As Silas pressed the golden sun-shaped key into the circular hole, the rock seemed to hum. Clara fitted the silver crescent into the moon slot, and Miller jammed the heavy iron square into the base. "Now!" Silas yelled. They turned the keys. For a heartbeat. Nothing happened. Then, a sound like 1,000 grinding teeth echoed through the mountain. The ground beneath their boots shook violently. Dust and small pebbles rained down from the cliffs above. Slowly, a thin line of golden light appeared in the center of the wall. The two halves of the massive stone gate began to slide into the mountain. As they opened, a rush of cool, ancient air flowed out. It smelled of ozone and forgotten incense. Inside. "Quick!" Silas pushed Clara and Miller through the opening. He turned back just in time to see Captain Vane reach the ledge. The pirate captain was breathless, his fine coat torn by thorns and salt. He raised his pistol, pointing it directly at Silas's chest. "Hand them over, Silas!" Vane roared. "The keys, the map, everything. You're a dead man if you take another step." Silas looked at the opening gate, then back at the man who had hunted him across the world. He didn't say a word. He stepped backward into the darkness of the temple. As soon as his boots cleared the threshold, the heavy stone doors began to slide shut. Vane lunged forward, his fingers clawing at the closing gap, but he was too slow. With a final, heavy thud, the gates sealed. The sounds of the battle and Vane's angry screams vanished, replaced by a silence so deep it felt like being underwater. They were inside the Sun Temple. The hallway ahead was lined with pillars of white marble, and the floor was tiled in patterns of gold and lapis lazuli. At the far end of the hall, a single pedestal stood under a shaft of natural light. Resting upon it was a glow so bright it hurt to look at directly. "The Great Pearl," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. But as they moved toward the light, Silas noticed something strange. The floor was covered in a thin layer of white sand, and in that sand were footprints, fresh footprints that didn't belong to any of them. The air inside the temple was warm and smelled of dried honey and old parchment. Unlike the cold, damp cave where they found the sun compass, this place felt alive. The walls were made of white marble that seemed to glow from within, and the floor was a masterpiece of blue and gold tiles. Every surface was covered in complex carvings of the stars, the seasons, and the great whale. "Silas, look at the sand," Clara whispered, pointing her lamp toward the floor. The footprints were clear. They weren't the heavy, boot-clumped tracks of a soldier or a sailor. They were the prints of bare feet, narrow and light. They led directly toward the center of the hall, where a massive shaft of golden light fell from a hole in the high ceiling. "Stay behind me," Silas commanded, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. They walked past rows of tall white pillars. As they reached the center of the room, they saw the source of the light. A pedestal made of solid obsidian, black as the night sky, stood in the middle of a circular pool of clear water. Floating just inches above the pedestal was the Great Pearl. It was the size of a cannonball, perfectly round, and it didn't just reflect light, it breathed it. The pearl pulsed with a soft, rhythmic glow that shifted from the pale yellow of a morning sun to the deep orange of a sunset. "It's not just a treasure," Clara said, her eyes wide with wonder. "Look at the water below it. It's moving in a circle, following the pearl's pulse. It is the heart of the island." A voice echoed through the hall. Silas spun around, his sword drawn in a flash. From behind a pillar stepped a figure cloaked in white linen. It was the elder, Kalen. He looked taller here, and the light of the temple made his white hair shine like silver. He held no weapon, only a wooden staff topped with a piece of blue glass. "How did you get here?" Silas asked, his eyes narrowing. "There is only one gate," The people of the lagoon have many paths, Captain, Kalen said with a small, knowing smile. But only one path leads to the truth. You have brought the 3 keys. You have shown courage, mercy to a traitor, and a spirit of discovery. But now comes the true test. I need that pearl to save my ship and my crew, Silas said, though his voice lacked its usual hardness. Mr. Thorn will destroy us if I return empty-handed. If you take the pearl from this room, Kalen said, walking toward the obsidian pedestal, the sun will no longer find this lagoon. The mist will grow thick, the trees will wither, and the great whale will leave these waters forever. The pearl is the anchor that holds this world together. Silas looked at the pearl, then back at the doors that sealed them away from Captain Vane. He thought of his hungry crew on the blue moon and the massive debt that hung over his head like a ghost. There is another way, Kalen continued, his voice soft. The pearl is a key, yes, but not a key to a door of gold. It is a key to the sun's breath. If you use it to power the temple, the mountain will provide for those who protect it. But the choice must be yours. Captain, will you be a thief of light, or its guardian? The silence in the temple was so heavy it felt like a physical weight. Silas looked into the swirling, golden depths of the great pearl. In its reflection, he didn't see a treasure hunter. He saw a man responsible for 40 souls currently fighting for their lives on the deck of the Blue Moon. If I leave it, Silas said, his voice raspy, my crew starves. Thorn's ships will hunt us until there's nothing left but splinters. That pearl is the only currency Thorn understands. Clara stepped forward, her hand resting gently on the obsidian pedestal. The water in the pool rippled around her fingers. Silas, look around. This island is a miracle. If we take the heart out of it, we aren't any better than Thorn. We'd be killing a world just to pay a debt. I'm a pirate, Clara. Silas reminded her with a tired, sharp wit. Stealing miracles is practically in the job description. He looked at Miller, the sailor who had braved the forest of thorns. Miller was hungry, his face drawn and pale, but he didn't reach for the pearl. He was looking at the carvings on the wall, drawings of a people living in harmony with the sea. The captain's right, Miller whispered. But the men, they followed us because they believed we were finding something better than just another bag of gold. Silas turned to Kalen. If I leave the pearl, we're trapped. Vane is outside those doors with 30 soldiers. My ship is surrounded. What does the sun's breath do for a man with his back against a stone wall? The elder smiled, a slow and ancient expression. The sun's breath is not a weapon of war, Silas. It is the power of the mountain. It commands the mist, the wind, and the light. It protects the lagoon. If you are its guardian, the mountain will provide the path. Silas sighed, a long sound that seemed to carry all the exhaustion of the journey. He took the 3 keys, the gold, the silver, and the iron, from the gate and held them over the water. I've spent my life chasing things that can be spent, Silas said. He looked at the pearl one last time, then turned his back on it. He walked to the base of the pedestal where 3 small, empty slots waited. Let's see what the mountain has to say. He jammed the iron key into the base, then the silver, and finally the gold. The temple didn't just shake this time. It sang. A deep, resonant hum vibrated through the floor tiles and up into Silas's bones. The great pearl began to spin, faster and faster, until it was a blur of pure white light. The shaft of sunlight hitting the ceiling didn't just reflect. It intensified, turning into a solid pillar of brilliance that shot upward through the mountain's peak. Outside, a low roar like a distant storm echoed through the lagoon. Silas ran to a small balcony that overlooked the water. He gasped. The sun's breath was a massive wall of golden mist, rolling down from the mountain and spreading across the lagoon like a tide. Where it touched the water, the wind picked up, turning into a fierce, controlled gale that blew directly toward the mouth of the lagoon. "The wind!" Silas shouted, a wild grin breaking across his face. "It's blowing out to sea. It's the perfect wind for an escape." But the miracle didn't stop there. As the light hit the water, the great silver whale breached the surface, letting out a call that sounded like a trumpet of victory. The enemy longboats were being tossed like toys in the new, powerful current. "Vane's ships can't sail against this," Clara cried. "Then we have a window," Silas said, his eyes hardening with a new purpose. "But we still have to get back to the ship. And Vane is still between us and the beach." The sun's breath had transformed the lagoon into a world of gold. The mist was so thick and luminous that Silas could barely see his own boots, yet he felt a strange clarity. The air was no longer heavy. It felt energized, pushing him forward with a gentle, persistent force. "The main gate is blocked by Vane and his men," Silas said, looking at Kalen. "Is there another way down? A path they won't expect?" Kalen nodded, his staff glowing with a soft blue light that seemed to cut through the golden haze. "The mountain has many veins, Captain. Follow the sound of the falling water. The path of the ancestors will take you to the hidden cove where the great whale rests." He pointed to a small, unassuming archway behind the obsidian pedestal. It was narrow and steep, carved into the very spine of the mountain. "What about you?" Clara asked, looking back at the elder. "My place is here, with the heart." Kalen replied, "Go now. The wind is yours for only a short time. Use it well." Silas, Clara, and Miller stepped into the dark tunnel. It wasn't a hallway. It was a series of steep, winding stairs that spiraled downward. They moved with a desperate speed, their breaths echoing against the damp stone. As they emerged from a low opening near the base of the cliffs, they were not on the main beach. They were in a small, secluded grotto, hidden from the main lagoon by a curtain of falling water. "Look!" Miller pointed through the spray. Through the golden mist, they could see the silhouette of the blue moon. She was no longer pinned against the cliffs. The powerful outward gale was pushing her toward the mouth of the lagoon. Barnaby had already raised the anchors, and the crew was desperately fighting to keep the ship steady in the swirling currents. They scrambled over the wet rocks toward their small rowboat, which they had dragged into the shadows earlier. But as they pushed it into the water, a figure emerged from the golden fog on the shoreline. It was Captain Vane. He was alone, separated from his soldiers by the confusing mist. His face was streaked with soot and rage. He had seen the light from the temple and realized he had been bypassed. "You think a bit of fog will stop me, Silas?" Vane snarled, leveling his flintlock pistol. "I've crossed 3 oceans for that pearl. I'm not leaving without a prize." "You're fighting the mountain now, Vane," Silas said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline. "The pearl stays. The lagoon is closed to you." Vane pulled the trigger. The dampness of the sun's breath had soaked his powder. The gun was useless. With a curse, he threw the pistol aside and drew his heavy cutlass, charging through the shallow water. Silas didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his own blade ringing as it met Vane's steel. The sparks from their swords looked like tiny stars in the golden mist. Silas was faster, fueled by a purpose Vane could never understand. With a clever parry and a powerful shove, Silas sent Vane stumbling back into the deep, churning current of the lagoon. "Get in the boat," Silas yelled to Clara and Miller. As they rowed toward the blue moon, the great silver whale breached one last time between them and the shore, its massive tail creating a wall of water that effectively ended the chase. The moment Silas's boots hit the deck of the blue moon, he felt the ship groan under the incredible force of the sun's breath. The golden mist was thick enough to taste, a mix of salt, ozone, and something ancient. Barnaby met him at the railing, his face smeared with soot but glowing with a fierce, relieved grin. "Captain! The wind, it's like the mountain itself is blowing us out to sea." Barnaby yelled over the roar of the gale. "Don't question the miracle, Barnaby. Just ride it." Silas shouted back. "Clara, get to the infirmary and check on the wounded. Miller, to the sheets. We're leaving this lagoon behind." The lagoon entrance was narrow, a treacherous throat of rock that had nearly claimed them on the way in. Now, with the outward wind at their backs, the blue moon moved with a speed Silas had never thought possible for a wooden vessel. The ship was moving at nearly 12 knots, her hull vibrating as she sliced through the green water. The water flowing out of the lagoon created a river in the sea, dragging the blue moon past the hidden reefs. The Golden Hawk was visible through the haze, but she was struggling. Her larger, heavier frame was caught in the crosscurrents. Captain Vane's men were desperately trying to turn their ship, but the golden gale was pushing them toward the outer cliffs. "They're trying to block the exit," Miller cried, pointing toward the Golden Hawk. The enemy ship was attempting to swing her broadside to fire her cannons. "They can't hold a steady line in this wind," Silas observed. He gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. He could feel the mountain's power flowing through the rudder. "Hold steady, everyone. We're going to pass them so close they could smell the tea in the galley." As the blue moon shot past the enemy's bow, the golden mist seemed to flare with one last, brilliant light. Silas looked up and saw the great silver whale breach one final time in the wake of his ship, a massive wall of water that forced the Golden Hawk to veer away to avoid a collision. As they cleared the mouth of the lagoon and hit the open ocean, the golden mist began to dissolve. The sun, once again a normal yellow sphere in a blue sky, felt strangely dim compared to the radiance of the temple. Silas looked back. The island of salt and the jungle shore were disappearing into a distant haze. The mountain, once glowing like a beacon, now looked like any other peak. The sun's breath had retreated, sealing the lagoon once more behind its wall of impossible mist. "We have no pearl, Silas," Clara said, stepping onto the deck. She had finished tending to the crew. No one had died, though many were bruised and battered. "Thorn is going to have our heads." Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. It wasn't the great pearl. It was a handful of the blue seeds Kaelin had given him from the temple's inner garden. "Maybe not," Silas said with a wink. Kaelin called these the sons of the sun. He said they grow in any soil and provide enough food for a city. A merchant like Thorn, he might find that more valuable than a single pearl once he realizes he can sell the harvest to every kingdom in the world. Barnaby laughed, a deep, booming sound. "A pirate who brings home seeds instead of silver. We'll be the talk of every tavern from here to the Cape. Better to be talked about than to be at the bottom of the sea," Silas replied. He looked at the horizon, where the path home finally lay open. The harbor of Oakhaven was exactly as they had left it, busy, loud, and smelling of tar and old fish. But as the blue moon limped into the docks, her sails patched and her hull scarred by salt and cannon fire, a hush fell over the crowd. Rumors of their demise had been circulating for weeks. Waiting at the end of the pier was Mr. Thorn. He looked as sharp and cold as a winter morning, surrounded by a dozen armed guards. He didn't look like a man who enjoyed surprises, and the sight of Silas's battered ship clearly annoyed him. Silas stepped off the gangplank, followed by Clara and Barnaby. He carried a small, unassuming leather pouch. "Captain Silas," Thorn said, his voice like dry parchment. "You look terrible. I assume that means you've brought me the Great Pearl, or you've come to hand over your ship's papers." "The pearl is where it belongs, Thorn," Silas said calmly. He tossed the leather pouch. It landed with a soft thud at the merchant's feet. I brought you something better. A way to never be hungry, or poor, again. Thorn peered into the bag, his face twisting in confusion. Seeds. You bring me a bag of bird food and expect me to forgive a debt that could buy a palace. Those aren't ordinary seeds. Clara stepped forward, her voice ringing with authority. Those are the sons of the sun. They grow in any soil, in any climate, and they produce fruit within a week. They are the most nutrient-dense food on this planet. Plant one, and you'll have a harvest. Plant 1,000, and you'll control the food supply of the entire coast. Thorn paused. He was a greedy man, but he was also a brilliant merchant. He knew that a diamond was only worth what someone was willing to pay. But food was something everyone had to buy. He looked at Silas, then at the seeds, his eyes calculating the potential profit. If this is a lie, Silas, I'll have you hanging from the gallows by sunset. Thorn warned. Plant one right there in that pot of dirt. Silas challenged, pointing to a decorative vase on the pier. Thorn did. Within minutes, under the warmth of the afternoon sun, the soil began to heave. A vibrant, blue-green sprout shot upward, unfurling waxy leaves that smelled of honey. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, a small, glowing fruit had formed. Thorn's jaw dropped. He looked at the fruit, then at the bag, and finally at Silas. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached into his coat and pulled out the heavy parchment that held the debt of the blue moon. He tore it into 4 pieces and let the wind carry them into the harbor. We're even, Captain. Thorn muttered, already gesturing for his men to carry the seeds to his warehouse. Now get out of my sight before I change my mind. That night, the crew of the Blue Moon celebrated in the finest tavern in Oak Haven. There was music, laughter, and enough food to make up for the weeks of hunger. But Silas stayed on the deck of his ship, looking out at the dark ocean. Clara joined him, 2 mugs of cider in her hands. So, what now, Captain? No debt, a fast ship, and a crew that would follow you into a volcano. Silas took a sip of the cider and smiled. I think the world is a lot bigger than Thorn's maps suggest. Clara, there are more lagoons, more mysteries, and definitely more adventures. Barnaby walked up, leaning his heavy arms on the railing. And Marcus, Captain, what about the man on the beach? We sail south tomorrow. Silas said, we have a friend to pick up. And then, we see where the wind takes us. As the stars began to appear, including the bright southern eye, Silas felt a sense of peace. The great pearl was still glowing in its temple. The silver whale was still guarding the lagoon, and the blue moon was finally, truly free. The morning sun over Oak Haven was pale and watery, a stark contrast to the golden brilliance of the lagoon. Silas stood on the quarterdeck, watching his crew scramble. They moved with a new lightness. The debt was gone, and for the first time in years, the ship belonged to them and no one else. We're making good time, Captain, Barnaby said, wiping grease from his hands. He'd been working on the rudder's hinge all morning. But the men are talking. They're wondering if Marcus is even still there. It's been weeks. The jungle isn't a kind place for a man alone. Marcus is a survivor, Silas replied, though he felt a prickle of doubt. He knows the sea, and he knows how to keep his head down. We owe him the chance. Clara emerged from the galley, carrying a tray of fresh bread. The smell was intoxicating. The town is buzzing. Silas, Thorn's new miracle fruit is already being talked about in every shop. He's calling it Thorn's celestial berry. He's not even giving the lagoon credit. Let him have his name, Silas said with a dry chuckle. As long as he keeps his hands off our hull, He can call it Thorn's Toes for all I care. The journey south was smooth. The winds were steady, almost as if the sun's breath had left a lingering blessing on their sails. But as they approached the coordinates of the jungle island, the atmosphere changed. The bright blue of the open ocean turned into a deep, bruised purple. Dark clouds hung low over the horizon, and the air grew thick with the smell of wet earth and rot. Storm coming? Barnaby asked, squinting. No. Silas whispered. This isn't weather. This is something else. When the island finally appeared, it didn't look like the lush paradise they had left. The green mountains were shrouded in a grey, sickly mist. The trees near the shoreline looked skeletal, their leaves turned to a dusty brown. What happened here? Clara asked, her voice trembling. It's only been a few weeks. A forest doesn't die that fast. They lowered the small boat and rowed toward the beach where they had left Marcus. The white sand was now covered in black, oily seaweed that smelled of sulfur. Silas stepped out first, his boots sinking into the muck. Marcus! He shouted. Marcus, it's Silas. We've come back. There was no answer, only the sound of the wind whistling through the dead branches of the jungle. They walked toward the site of Marcus's camp. The tent Silas had given him was torn to shreds, the fabric flapping like a ghost's garment. The fishing line was snapped, and the bag of dried meat was scattered, untouched by animals. Captain, look, Miller said, pointing to a large, flat rock. Scratched into the stone with a sharp tool were hundreds of tally marks. But below the marks, a single word was carved in large, jagged letters. Watchers. Suddenly, a high-pitched whistle echoed from the trees. It was an organic, shrieking sound. A shadow moved at the edge of the forest, tall, thin, and moving with a jerky, unnatural speed. That's not Marcus. Barnaby growled, reaching for his axe. The jungle, it seemed, had not been empty when they left their comrade behind, and whatever lived in the shadows had found him first. The screeching sound echoed again, bouncing off the skeletal trees and making the hair on Silas's neck stand up. From the murky depths of the dying jungle, more shadows emerged. They were tall and spindly, their limbs far too long for their bodies, wrapped in tattered grey rags that looked more like rotted skin than fabric. They didn't walk so much as glide, their movements twitchy and punctuated by sudden, violent starts. Form a circle. Silas roared, his sword ringing as it left its sheath. Back to back. Miller, watch the left. Clara pulled a small, heavy flare from her doctor's bag, a mixture of sulfur and magnesium she'd brewed for emergencies. Whatever they are. Silas, they don't like the light. Look at how they flinch when the sun hits the sand. She was right. The creatures stayed just within the fringe of the grey mist, their large, pale eyes blinking rapidly. They had no noses, only slits in their grey faces, and their mouths were filled with rows of needle-like teeth. One of the creatures hissed and lunged. It moved with a terrifying speed, its long claws raking the air where Miller had been standing a second before. Miller swung his heavy cutlass, catching the creature across the arm. Instead of red blood, a thick, black fluid seeped from the wound, smelling of old oil and stagnant water. The creature didn't cry out, it simply backed away, its pale eyes fixed on Miller with a cold, hollow intensity. They aren't alive. Barnaby grunted, slamming the butt of his axe into the sand. At least, not like any animal I've ever hunted. They feel like echoes. The Watchers. Silas whispered, remembering the carving on the rock. Marcus wasn't hiding from them. He was warning us. Silas, look at the ground. Clara shouted. Where the black fluid from the creature hit the sand, the white crystals turned black and began to smoke. The decay wasn't just spreading, it was being bled into the island. These creatures were the source of the rot. Suddenly, A voice cracked through the tension. It was faint, coming from a cluster of rocks further up the beach. "Down! Get down!" A heavy iron net, weighted with stones, flew through the air, draping over the two nearest creatures. They thrashed wildly, their claws tangling in the metal links. A figure scrambled out from behind the rocks, face covered in mud and eyes wide with a manic energy. It was Marcus, but he looked like a wild man. His clothes were gone, replaced by woven seaweed, and he carried a spear tipped with a sharpened piece of white coral. "Follow the tide!" Marcus screamed, gesturing wildly toward a narrow cave entrance hidden by the black seaweed. "They can't cross the salt spray. Run!" Silas didn't need to be told twice. "To the cave! Move!" They sprinted across the oily sand, the shadow dwellers hissing behind them as they tore through the iron net with supernatural strength. Silas was the last one in, sliding through the narrow opening just as a grey hand slammed against the rock face. Inside, the air was salty and sharp, filled with the mist of an underground spring that connected to the sea. Marcus stood at the back of the cave, trembling. He dropped his spear and sank to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You came back," Marcus whispered, looking at Silas with a mixture of hope and terror. I thought the Watchers had taken the whole world." "What are they, Marcus?" Silas asked, kneeling beside his old friend. "And what happened to the island?" Marcus looked at the cave walls, where he had scratched more symbols in the dark. "They came from the depths after you left. They are the shadow of the pearl. When you moved the heart in the temple, something woke up here. The balance is broken, Captain. And they are hungry." The cave was damp, the air thick with the scent of brine and ancient stone. Outside, the screeching of the shadow dwellers had faded into a low, rhythmic thrumming, like the beating of a sickly heart. Marcus sat huddled near a small pool of seawater, his hands shaking as he clutched a piece of dried kelp. "The balance," Marcus whispered, his eyes darting to the cave entrance. "Silas, you didn't just find a treasure. You shifted the weight of the world. The pearl was the light, but every light casts a shadow. When you activated the sun's breath, that shadow had to go somewhere. It bled into the roots of this island." Clara knelt by the entrance, where the black, oily fluid from the creature Miller had wounded was still smeared on the rock. She opened her medical kit and pulled out a small glass vial and a silver stirring rod. "It's not biological," Clara noted, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Look at how it reacts to the salt." She dropped a grain of sea salt into a sample of the black goo. The fluid hissed and curled away, turning into a fine, grey ash. "It's a form of concentrated entropy. It doesn't just kill, it makes. The alchemy of decay." Clara began to sketch a diagram in her notebook, trying to map the spread of the corruption. She explained her theory to the group. The catalyst. The activation of the Sun Temple created a massive surge of positive energy. The reaction. To maintain equilibrium, a negative echo was pushed through the tectonic veins of the seabed, surfacing at the nearest anchor point, this island. The result. The island's great root, the central tree that sustains the ecosystem, has been turned into a conductor for this decay. If the great root is poisoned, Silas said, looking at the dead forest outside, then the whole island becomes a nursery for those things. It's already happening, Marcus said, his voice cracking. I saw it. At the center of the island, where the spring used to be, there's a tree that looks like it's made of obsidian. Its roots are moving. Silas. They're reaching into the sea. If they reach the deep currents, the rot will spread to the mainland. Silas felt a cold weight in his stomach. This wasn't just a debt to a merchant. This was a debt to the world. They had inadvertently started a plague of shadows. We have to sever it, Silas declared, standing up and checking the flint on his pistol. "We find this obsidian tree and we cut the rot out at the source. You can't just hack at it with a sword," Clara warned. "The fluid is acidic. It'll melt the steel before you make a dent. We need something to neutralize the entropy. We need the salt of the lagoon. We don't have time to sail back to the Blue Lagoon," Barnaby pointed out. "We don't have to," Silas said, a slow grin forming. "We have the great whale. If he's the guardian of the lagoon, he carries its essence in his wake. We just need to call him." Marcus looked at Silas as if he were mad. "Call a whale? While the shore is crawling with monsters? I've done crazier things for a bag of gold, Marcus," Silas said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Doing it for a friend and a whole island. That's almost easy." The cave felt like it was shrinking. Every time the wind howled outside, it carried the scratching sound of long, needle-thin claws against the rock. Silas reached into the hidden pocket of his coat and pulled out the small, ornate whistle. It was made of the same shimmering material as the great whale's skin, a gift from the village of the Blue Lagoon that he hadn't fully understood until now. "The salt spray in this cave is our only shield," Marcus whispered, his eyes glued to the dark opening. "If we step out there, the watchers will be on us in seconds. They don't have ears, Silas. They feel the heat of your blood. Then we make them feel something else," Silas replied. He looked at Clara. "You said the essence of the lagoon neutralizes the rot. If the whale comes, his wake will bring the pure water we need." The dash to the shore. Silas laid out the plan with the quick, sharp precision of a man who had spent his life outrunning storms. The diversion. Barnaby and Miller would use the remaining iron nets and spare gunpowder to create a distraction at the cave's secondary entrance. The sprint. Silas and Clara would head for the whale's tooth, a jagged rock formation that jutted into the deep water where the current was strongest. The signal. Silas would use the whistle to call the guardian. "On 3. Silas commanded. The cave exploded into motion. Barnaby tossed a small keg of dampened powder into the brush near the side entrance. The resulting cloud of thick, acrid smoke drew the shrieks of the shadow dwellers toward the forest. Silas and Clara bolted for the water. The air outside was cold and tasted of ash. The grey mist swirled around them, and Silas could feel the watchers turning their sightless faces toward the heat of his heartbeat. One of the creatures lunged from a dead tree, its grey rags fluttering. Silas didn't stop. He fired his pistol into the sand at the creature's feet, the flash of light sending it reeling back into the shadows. The silver note. They reached the whale's tooth, a slippery spire of stone drenched in sea spray. Silas climbed to the highest point, his boots sliding on the black, oily seaweed. He put the silver whistle to his lips and blew. There was no sound, at least, not one the human ear could catch. But the air around the whistle suddenly rippled, like heat rising from a desert. The water in the bay, previously sluggish and black, began to vibrate. Deep beneath the surface, a massive, glowing shape began to rise. It was a light that didn't belong in this dying world, a pure, sapphire blue. "He heard us," Clara gasped, pointing to the horizon. A mile out, the great silver whale breached. It didn't splash, it seemed to shatter the surface of the ocean. A massive wave of crystalline, salt-rich water, the essence of the Blue Lagoon, began to roll toward the shore. As the wave hit the black, oily seaweed, the corruption didn't just wash away, it evaporated into white steam. The whale let out a low, resonant boom that shook the very foundation of the island. It was a song of the deep, a frequency of life that acted like a physical blow to the shadow dwellers. They shrieked in agony, their spindly forms dissolving into grey dust as the blue light touched them. "The path to the obsidian tree is open," Silas shouted over the roar of the surf. But we have to move while the whale is still singing. The path through the jungle was no longer a tangle of green. It was a cemetery of grey wood. The great whale's song still vibrated in the air, a low hum that kept the shadows at bay. But the further Silas, Clara, and Marcus pushed inland, the weaker that protection felt. The ground was soft and spongy, exhaling puffs of black dust with every step. The spring is just ahead, Marcus whispered, his coral spear leveled at the gloom. But it doesn't taste like water anymore. It tastes like copper and old graves. They broke into the central clearing, and even Silas, who had seen the Sun Temple's majesty, felt his breath hitch. Where the island's great root once stood, a majestic cedar that could be seen from miles at sea, there was now a jagged monument of obsidian. It looked like a tree made of frozen smoke, its branches sharp as glass and dripping with the oily black fluid. The anatomy of the corruption. The tree wasn't just sitting on the surface. It was a parasitic heart that had replaced the island's natural soul. Clara knelt at the edge of the clearing, careful not to touch the blackened soil. She pointed toward the base of the obsidian trunk. The siphon. The main trunk was pulsing, pulling energy from the earth's heat. The veins. Glowing purple lines ran down the branches, carrying the entropy into the roots. The anchor. The roots weren't wooden. They were thick, rope-like tubes of shadow that burrowed deep into the island's aquifer. If those roots hit the main underwater current, Clara explained, her voice urgent, this poison won't just stay here. It will travel thousands of miles. It's a biological clock. Silas, and it's almost at midnight. How do we kill something that isn't alive? Barnaby asked, joining them as he and Miller finished securing the perimeter. We don't kill it, Silas said, pulling the iron key from his belt. Though the gold and silver keys were for the temple, the iron key, the key of the earth, felt strangely warm in his hand. We ground it. We give that energy somewhere else to go. The final severance. Silas stepped toward the obsidian tree. The air grew colder, and a high-pitched whine filled his ears, trying to drown out the whale's song. The tree sensed him. The oily fluid began to bubble at the base, forming small, twitching shapes that looked like the claws of the watchers. Cover me, Silas yelled. Barnaby and Miller opened fire, their muskets flashing in the grey light, pinning the shadow growths back. Clara threw the last of her salt vials into the pool at the tree's base, creating a temporary zone of white steam. Silas reached the trunk. He didn't use his sword. He took the iron key and jammed it into a glowing purple knot in the obsidian bark. The tree let out a sound like shattering glass. A massive surge of dark energy flowed through the key, but instead of killing Silas, the metal acted as a lightning rod. The earth property of the key began to pull the shadow energy out of the tree and drive it deep into the bedrock where it could be harmlessly absorbed. The obsidian began to crack. Spiders of white light raced up the trunk, turning the black glass into dull, lifeless stone. With a final, deafening crack, the tree shattered, its roots shriveling and retreating from the water. The grey mist began to lift. For the first time in weeks, a single ray of genuine sunlight pierced the canopy, hitting the spot where the tree had stood. It's over, Marcus breathed, falling to his knees as the pressure in the air vanished. Not yet, Silas said, looking at the shriveled remains. We've stopped the rot, but the island is still a graveyard. We need to give it back its heart. The silence that followed the shattering of the obsidian tree was more profound than the roar of the battle. For a moment, no one moved. Silas stood over the fragments of black glass, his hands still tingling from the surge of energy that had passed through the iron key. The ground, once pulsing with a sickly purple light, was now dull and cold. Is it truly gone? Miller asked, his musket lowered but his eyes still scanning the grey shadows of the jungle. The source is destroyed, Silas said, wiping sweat and soot from his brow. But Marcus was right. The island is hollowed out. Look at the soil. He kicked a clod of earth. It crumbled into a fine, grey ash that smelled of nothing. The life had been sucked out of the land to feed the obsidian tree. Even with the corruption gone, the island looked like a skeleton, a boneyard of trees that would never again see a green leaf. Marcus knelt by the empty spring. I survived the Watchers only to live on a corpse. He whispered. Without the great root, the water won't stay. The rains will wash this sand into the sea, and there will be nothing left but rock. Clara walked to the center of the clearing, her eyes fixed on the spot where the iron key had grounded the shadow energy. She looked at Silas. You still have them, don't you? The seeds from the Sun Temple. Silas reached into his heavy coat and pulled out a small, weathered leather pouch. He opened it to reveal 3 seeds, glowing with a soft, sapphire light. These were the true sons of the sun. The ones Kalen had whispered were the primal stock of the temple's garden. Kalen said these seeds grow in any soil. Silas said. But he also said they require a gift of the spirit to wake them. The whale. Clara said, turning toward the sound of the distant surf. The whale isn't just a guardian. It's a gardener. Its song is the frequency of life. As if the great silver whale had heard her, a massive, resonant low-frequency boom echoed from the bay. The ground vibrated beneath their feet. At the same time, the clouds that had choked the island for weeks finally parted. A single, focused beam of golden sunlight struck the center of the clearing, exactly where the obsidian had shattered. Silas knelt. He pressed the 3 blue seeds into the grey ash. He didn't just drop them, he buried them deep, his fingers touching the cool bedrock. Grow. He whispered. The reaction was not a slow sprout. It was an explosion of life. A vine of brilliant, luminous green erupted from the ash, racing outward in a perfect circle. Everywhere the vine touched the grey soil, the earth turned a deep, moist black. Tiny white flowers bloomed and died in seconds, leaving behind thick, rich grass. The spring bed began to gurgle. Clear water, smelling of rain and honey, bubbled up from the depths, filling the basin and spilling over into the new greenery. The skeletal trees nearby began to shiver, their bark turned from grey to brown, and within minutes, heavy green leaves unfurled, casting a cooling shade over the group. It's a miracle. Barnaby breathed, reaching out to touch a leaf that hadn't existed moments ago. It's balance. Silas corrected. He stood up, watching the jungle rapidly reclaim its territory. The sons of the sun were doing in minutes what nature took decades to achieve. The island was no longer a graveyard. It was a cradle. Marcus stood up, his face clean for the first time in weeks, washed by the spray of the new spring. He looked at Silas, then at the blue moon anchored in the distance. I don't think I can leave yet, Captain. Marcus said softly. Someone needs to watch over this. Someone needs to make sure the shadows don't find a way back. Silas nodded, a sad but proud smile on his face. We'll leave you the supplies you need, Marcus. And this time, you won't be hiding. You'll be the warden of the rebirth. The farewell to Marcus was quiet, marked only by the rustle of the new, vibrant leaves and the steady gurgle of the restored spring. Silas felt a strange mixture of relief and melancholy as he watched his old friend stand tall on the shore, no longer a scavenger but a guardian. As the blue moon weighed anchor and the wind caught her sails, the island receded into a blur of lush emerald. He'll be all right, Silas, Clara said, leaning against the railing beside him. The island is alive again, and I think, in a way, he is too. I hope so, Silas replied, though his eyes weren't on the shore. He was looking at the compass, the golden sun compass they had retrieved from Thorn's men. Its needle wasn't pointing north, nor was it pointing toward the Sun Temple. Instead, it was spinning slowly, a lazy, rhythmic circle that seemed to mimic the pulse of the Great Pearl. The phenomenon of the hull. As they moved into deeper water, far beyond the shelf of the volcanic island, a new sensation took hold. It wasn't a sound at first, but a vibration. It started in the soles of the crew's feet, a low-frequency hum that resonated through the oak planks of the hull. "Captain, do you hear that?" Barnaby asked, coming up from the lower decks. "The men in the hold are spooked. They say the wood is talking to them." Silas followed Barnaby down into the belly of the ship. In the stillness of the cargo hold, the sound was clearer. It was a sequence of clicks and long, melodic moans, muffled by leagues of seawater but unmistakable. It sounded like the great whale, but it was deeper, older, and multiplied by 1,000 voices. "It's a song," Clara whispered, joining them in the dark. She pressed her ear against a support beam. "But it's not just one whale. It's a network. Like a conversation happening across the entire ocean floor. The deep sea signal." Clara, ever the scientist, went to her cabin and returned with a primitive listening device, a copper funnel attached to a long, hollow tube. She lowered the end of the funnel into a barrel of seawater that sat on the deck, creating a bridge for the vibrations. "Listen," she said, handing the tube to Silas. The sound was no longer just a hum. It was organized. Silas heard the rhythmic clicking, then a sudden, sharp spike in pitch that sounded like a warning. Between the notes, there was a metallic scraping sound, as if something gargantuan was moving across a field of iron. Pattern 1. 3 long moans. Pattern 2. Rapid clicks. Pattern 3. A low, guttural vibration that made the water in the barrel dance in geometric shapes. "The compass is reacting to it," Silas noted. Every time the low vibration hit, the needle of the sun compass jerked toward the southeast. Whatever is making that noise is drawing the compass's focus. It's not a magnetic pull. It's an energetic one. The sons of the sun seeds we planted, they were just the beginning, Silas said, looking at the dark water. Kalen mentioned the Sun Temple was one of 3. If the pearl is the heart, and the lagoon is the lungs, then something out there is the mind of this whole system. Suddenly, the ocean surface a mile ahead began to churn. It wasn't the great silver whale. A series of dark, jagged spires began to rise from the depths. Black pillars of stone that hadn't been on any chart. They were covered in glowing bioluminescent barnacles, pulsing in time with the whispers coming through the hull. "Reef ahead," Miller screamed from the crow's nest. "But Captain, the reef is moving." The sea didn't just churn, it boiled. What Miller had called a moving reef was actually a series of geometric pillars, rising from the abyss with a slow, grinding inevitability. They were made of the same dark, volcanic glass as the tree on the island, but these were ancient and weathered, encrusted with glowing, crystalline growths that pulsed in sync with the sun compass in Silas's hand. "They're forming a circle," Barnaby shouted, throwing his weight against the wheel to keep the ship from being sucked into the rising wake. "It's a trap, Captain. We're being boxed in." "Not a trap," Clara argued, clutching the railing as she watched the bioluminescence flare. "Look at the alignment. They're positioned like the standing stones of the old world, but these are tuned to the ocean's frequency. They're a relay station." The labyrinth of glass. Silas looked at the sun compass. The needle had stopped spinning. It was now locked onto a single point between 2 of the tallest spires. The gap was narrow, hardly wider than the blue moon herself, and the water there was a swirling vortex of foam and blue light. "We go through the center," Silas commanded. "Through that," Miller yelled from the mast. "Captain, the current will tear the hull apart. We'll be ground to splinters against the obsidian." "The iron key is guiding the ship," Silas said, pulling the heavy metal object from his bag. It was vibrating so fiercely that his arm felt numb. The key isn't just for locks. It's a conductor. It's talking to the spires. Observations of the spire array. Clara quickly noted the patterns of the glowing growths on the pillars. She realized that the barnacles were actually sensory nodules, reacting to the ship's proximity. As the blue moon entered the ring of spires, the roar of the ocean suddenly vanished. Inside the circle, the water was as flat and still as a mirror, despite the storm-tossed seas only a few hundred yards away. The silence was eerie, broken only by the shimmering song of the glass pillars. "Look down," Clara whispered. Below the ship, the water was transparent. Thousands of feet below, Silas could see a city of light, a massive, glowing network of structures that stretched across the ocean floor. It looked like a map of the stars, made of fire and water. The Sun Temple wasn't the goal, Silas realized, his voice hushed with awe. It was the gatehouse. The blue lagoon was the entrance. This is the archive. Suddenly, the iron key in his hand emitted a sharp, golden flash. One of the spires ahead began to sink back into the water, revealing a staircase of stone that led down into the very heart of the ocean, protected by a shimmering bubble of air. "We aren't just sailors anymore," Silas said, looking at the crew. "We're intruders in the workshop of the gods." The transition from the deck of the Blue Moon to the stone staircase felt like stepping through a thin sheet of cold silk. As Silas, Clara, and Barnaby descended, the shimmering bubble of air held firm, pushing back the weight of millions of tons of seawater. Above them, the keel of their ship looked like a dark, resting whale. Below, the staircase wound down into a canyon of glowing blue light. "The pressure should be crushing us," Clara whispered, her hand tracing the invisible barrier. "By all laws of physics, we should be flatter than a dried biscuit. But the air here, it feels light, fresh." "It's the pearl's influence," Silas said, holding the iron key before him like a lantern. "The energy we grounded on the island didn't just wake the trees. It signaled the archive that a key bearer was approaching." The Hall of Living Light. At the bottom of the stairs, they entered a chamber that defied everything Silas knew about architecture. There were no shelves, no books, and no scrolls. Instead, the walls were made of a translucent, honeycombed crystal. Inside each cell of the honeycomb, a tiny spark of light flickered. "Knowledge here isn't written," Clara realized, her eyes reflecting the million dancing sparks. "It's stored as resonance. Every spark is a memory, a blueprint, or a history." As they walked, the sparks reacted to their presence. A cell to Silas's left flared bright gold, and a projection appeared in the air, a shimmering, three-dimensional map of the entire ocean. It wasn't the flat, distorted map Silas used at sea. It showed the mountain ranges beneath the waves, the deep trenches, and three specific points glowing with intense heat. The Sun Temple, the heart, source of power, the archive, the mind, source of knowledge, the abyss forge, the hand, source of creation, the forge. Barnaby muttered, his hand resting on his axe. "If the pearl powers this world, and the archive remembers it, then the forge is where it was made. And look where it is." He pointed to the map. The third glowing point was located in the deepest, darkest part of the ocean, far to the west of the known shipping lanes. It was an area sailors called the Devil's Throat, a place where the water was said to boil and no bird ever flew. The Guardian's warning. Suddenly, the floor beneath them vibrated. The golden light of the map turned a sharp, warning red. A voice, not heard with ears but felt in the marrow of their bones, echoed through the chamber. "The balance is restored, but the shadow lingers. The forge is cold, and the architect sleeps. To wake the world, the three must be one." The keys. Silas realized. The gold, the silver, and the iron. They aren't just for opening doors. They have to be taken to the forge. But Silas, Clara warned, pointing at the projection. Look at the shadow the voice mentioned. On the map, a dark, oily stain was spreading from the direction of Oakhaven. It wasn't the shadow dwellers they had fought on the island. It was something else, a mechanical, rigid darkness. Thorn. Silas growled. He didn't just plant the seeds. He's trying to industrialize the miracle, and he's tearing the fabric of the world to do it. The ascent from the submerged archive was faster than the descent. It was as if the ocean itself was eager to push them back to the surface, sensing the urgency of the red warning light that had filled the Hall of Memories. When Silas, Clara, and Barnaby broke the surface of the shimmering bubble and climbed back onto the deck of the Blue Moon, the air they breathed didn't taste of the salty spray they loved. It tasted of coal, sulfur, and burnt sugar. "Captain, look at the horizon," Miller said, his voice trembling as he pointed toward the north. The clear blue sky of the open sea was being choked by a thick, greasy smear of black smoke. It wasn't the natural mist of the lagoon or the grey rot of the island. This was heavy, artificial, and smelled of 1,000 furnaces. Thorn. Silas growled. He didn't just plant the seeds. He's burning them. The perversion of the miracle. Clara hurried to the side of the ship, dipping a bucket into the water. When she pulled it up, the surface was covered in a thin, iridescent film of oil. He's found a way to extract the energy from the sons of the sun at an accelerated rate. He's not growing food, Silas. He's refining the seeds into a high-potency fuel. The energy of the Sun Temple was meant to sustain life. Clara explained, her eyes darkening. But Thorn is using it to power heat. He's built engines, massive, iron-bound things, that consume the seeds to turn wheels and pistons. He's forcing the 17th century into a mechanical nightmare. As if to prove her point, a low, rhythmic thumping sound began to vibrate through the water. It wasn't the song of the whales. It was the harsh, metallic clanging of a paddle wheel. Emerging from the black smoke was a ship unlike any Silas had ever seen. It had no sails, only 2 massive chimneys belching fire and soot, and its hull was plated in jagged sheets of bolted iron. An ironclad. Barnaby whispered, horrified. How did he build that so fast? He didn't build it. Silas realized. He used the archive's blueprints. He must have sent his own scholars to the ruins we left behind. He's raiding the knowledge of the gods to build the tools of a tyrant. The confrontation. The iron ship, named the Sovereign of Soot, turned its massive, steam-powered turrets toward the Blue Moon. It didn't need the wind to move. It churned the water into a muddy froth, ignoring the currents that Silas had spent a lifetime mastering. He's coming for the keys, Silas said, reaching for the wheel. He knows he needs the gold, silver, and the iron to fully unlock the Abyss Forge. If he gets to the forge, he won't just be a merchant. He'll be the master of the planet's temperature. A voice boomed across the water, amplified by a massive brass megaphone on the ironclad's deck. Captain Silas. Return the artifacts to the Oakhaven Trading Company. You are in possession of stolen corporate property. Silas looked at his crew, exhausted, lean, but eyes bright with the fires of the temple. Then he looked at the iron key, which was still humming in his pocket. Miller. Raise the black flag. Silas commanded. We might be outgunned, and we're certainly outsteamed, but we have the wind of the sun's breath in our hearts. We're heading for the devil's throat. If Thorn wants these keys, he's going to have to follow us into the deep. The sea behind the Blue Moon was no longer the pristine blue of the open ocean. It was a churning wake of oily sludge and white foam, carved by the massive paddle wheels of the Sovereign of Soot. The ironclad was a beast of clanking pistons and shrieking steam, a mechanical predator that didn't care for the elegance of the wind. "She's gaining, Captain," Miller yelled from the rigging. "The smoke is thick enough to walk on, and she's not slowing down for the swells." Silas gripped the wheel, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky met the sea in a jagged line of dark, swirling clouds. That was the Devil's Throat, a massive oceanic vortex created by the intersection of three major thermal currents. The physics of the pursuit. Clara stood by the railing, observing the ironclad through her brass telescope. She was scribbling furiously in her journal, trying to understand the source of Thorn's new power. His bypassed the natural laws of combustion. She muttered, mostly to herself. "The seeds are being used as a catalyst for a high-pressure steam reaction. If my calculations are correct, the temperature inside those boilers is exceeding 300 degrees Celsius. If he pushes it any harder, he'll blow his own hull apart." Silas shouted over the wind. "He won't have to." Clara replied, "At that speed, he'll ram us before we reach the outer rim of the vortex. We need to shed weight, Silas, or we need more lift." Tactical maneuvers. Silas looked at the three keys resting on the binnacle. The iron key was glowing with a dull, rhythmic pulse, vibrating in sync with the deep-sea currents below. "Barnaby, dump the extra water barrels. Keep only what we need for 3 days," Silas commanded, "and tell the men to move the remaining ballast to the aft. We need the bow high to ride the thermal updrafts." As the blue moon lightened, she began to skip across the waves. But Thorn's ship responded. A massive plume of blacker-than-black smoke erupted from its chimneys, and the Sovereign surged forward, the iron plating on its bow glowing a faint, heat-stressed red. "They're prepping the long-range harpoons," Barnaby roared, pointing to the ironclad's deck. "They don't want to sink us, they want to tether us." The first harpoon whistled through the air, a massive iron bolt trailing a thick steel cable. It splashed just feet from the rudder. The second one tore through the corner of the mainsail, sending a jolt through the entire ship. "We're at the edge," Silas yelled, pointing ahead. The water was beginning to slope downward, a terrifying curve of dark water that led into the heart of the Devil's Throat. "Everyone, tie yourselves to the masts. We're going down the drain." The Sovereign of Soot didn't hesitate. Thorn was so blinded by the promise of the Abyss Forge that he followed them right into the maw of the vortex, his engines screaming in a mechanical agony that rivaled the roar of the sea. The world tipped. It wasn't the gentle roll of a storm wave, but a terrifying, permanent slant as the blue moon crossed the event horizon of the Devil's Throat. The ocean, once a flat expanse, had become a funnel of roaring, sapphire-black glass. Gravity seemed to change its mind, pulling the ship not just down, but sideways toward the center of the spinning abyss. "She's not responding to the rudder," Barnaby screamed, his boots slipping on the drenched deck. "The water's moving faster than we are. Stop fighting the current." Silas yelled back, his arms straining against the wooden spokes of the wheel. "If we fight it, we'll snap the keel. We have to surf the curve. Miller, furl the sails. We're a leaf in a drain now." The physics of the abyss. As the ship descended into the throat, the centrifugal force pinned the crew against the starboard railing. Clara, lashed to the mainmast with a thick hemp rope, watched the wall of water rise above them. To their left, a mountain of ocean surged. To their right, the dark, empty eye of the vortex waited like a hungry god. In the center of such a massive vortex, the pressure gradient force and the centrifugal force reach a violent equilibrium. The velocity of the water increases as the radius decreases, according to the principles of angular momentum. "Look at the Sovereign," Clara cried, pointing toward the rim of the funnel. Thorn's ironclad was in trouble. While the blue moon was light and flexible, the Sovereign of Soot was a rigid, heavy beast of iron. Its massive paddle wheels were spinning uselessly, cavitation foam turning the dark water white. The iron ship was too heavy to surf the curve. It was sliding toward the center at a much sharper angle, its boilers shrieking as the cold seawater sprayed against the glowing metal. The battle of sail versus steam. The Blue Moon. By shedding weight and furling sails, Silas was utilizing the ship's shallow draft to maintain a stable, spiraling descent. The iron key, still clutched in Silas's hand, seemed to be smoothing the water directly ahead of their bow. The Sovereign of Soot. Thorn's ship was fighting the vortex with brute force. The massive steam engines were straining at 350 degrees Celsius, trying to propel the iron hull across the grain of the current. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the Sovereign. One of the high-pressure steam pipes, overstressed by the violent tossing of the ship, had burst. A cloud of scalding white vapor enveloped the ironclad's deck. "She's losing power," Barnaby noted. "She's slipping into the eye." "We're all going into the eye," Silas said grimly. "But we're going in on our own terms." The sun compass on the binnacle began to glow with a blinding white light. The three keys, gold, silver, and iron, started to hum in a three-part harmony that drowned out the roar of the vortex. The center of the whirlpool was no longer a dark void, a glowing blue portal, identical to the one in the submerged archive, was rising to meet them. "Hold your breath," Silas commanded as the ship reached the bottom of the funnel. The Blue Moon plunged into the blue light. For a second, there was no sound, no weight, and no fear. Then, with a sudden pop of pressure, the roar returned. But it was the roar of fire, not water. They had passed through the throat and entered the realm of the Abyss Forge. The transition was like being hammered on an anvil. One moment, they were drowning in the cold, crushing weight of the vortex. The next, the air was searing, smelling of sulfur and molten copper. The Blue Moon didn't land in water. She dropped onto a cushion of superheated steam, sliding down a massive, sloping flume of polished basalt that led into the heart of the world. "Look up," Clara choked out, shielding her eyes from the sudden radiance. They were in a cavern so vast it had its own weather. Thousands of feet above, the ceiling was the underside of the ocean floor, held up by pillars of glowing obsidian that pulsed with the rhythm of a heartbeat. Below them lay the Abyss Forge. It wasn't a building. It was a living machine of gears the size of islands and rivers of white-hot magma channeled through transparent glass pipes. The mechanics of the hand. The forge was the hand Kalen had spoken of, the place where the raw energy of the Earth's core was tempered and shaped. Here, the temperature was a constant battle between the freezing seawater being pumped in from the vents and the 1,200 degrees Celsius magma being siphoned from the mantle. "The thermal equilibrium here is impossible," Clara whispered, checking her brass thermometer. "The heat transfer should have vaporized us instantly, but the air is being held in a stasis field by the vibration of those gears." Silas steered the ship toward a central platform, a massive, circular dock made of brass and silver that floated in a lake of liquid light. In the center of the dock stood the Anvil of Ages, a structure with three distinct mechanical arms reaching toward the ceiling. At the base of the arms were three keyholes. "We have to get the keys to the anvil," Silas said, his voice raspy from the heat. "If we don't seat them, the pressure in this cavern will continue to build until the ocean floor collapses." A thunderous crash echoed from the far side of the cavern. A jagged shape tore through the steam. The Sovereign of Soot. Thorn's ironclad had survived the vortex, but it was a wreck. Its iron plating was warped. One of its chimneys had snapped off, and its paddle wheels were glowing a dull, dangerous red. "He's still coming," Barnaby growled, pointing at the ironclad as it ground against the edge of the brass dock. "He's like a tick that won't let go." Thorn stepped onto the deck of his ruined ship, his fine coat burned away, his eyes wild with a feverish greed. He held a massive steam cannon, connected by a hose to his ship's failing boiler. "The keys, Silas," Thorn roared, the sound amplified by the cavern's acoustics. "The forge is mine. I will turn the sun itself into a fuel for my empire." Silas grabbed the gold key. It was so hot it scorched his leather glove. But he didn't let go. "The forge doesn't belong to men like you, Thorn. It belongs to the balance." The brass dock hummed beneath Silas's boots, a deep, rhythmic vibration that felt like the pulse of the planet. Steam hissed from the seams of the metal floor, and the air was thick with the scent of ozone and heated oil. In the center, the Anvil of Ages towered over them, a masterpiece of celestial engineering, with 3 massive mechanical arms frozen in an upward reach, waiting for the keys that would restart the heart of the world. "Barnaby, Miller, stay with the ship. If the pressure spikes, you'll need to vent the steam or the blue moon will pop like an overripe fruit." Silas shouted, his voice nearly drowned out by the roar of the magma falls. "I'm coming with you," Clara said, her face set in a mask of determination. She carried a heavy leather satchel filled with her chemical vials. "That steam cannon Thorn is carrying is a high-pressure disaster. If he ruptures a line, we're all vapor." Thorn stumbled off the gangplank of the Sovereign, dragging the heavy brass nozzle of the steam cannon behind him. The hose hissed and writhed like a dying snake, connected back to the ironclad's groaning boilers. Thorn's eyes were bloodshot, his skin reddened by the heat, and a manic grin stretched across his face. "You don't understand the power here, Silas," Thorn shrieked. "This isn't just a balance. This is an infinite engine. With the forge, I can power the world. I can make the night as bright as the day. I will be the architect of the new age. You're building an empire on a foundation of soot, Thorn." Silas countered, moving toward the first arm of the anvil, the one marked with the symbol of the sun. "Look at the pressure gauges. The cavern can't hold this much energy without the stabilization of the keys. You're going to bury Oak Haven and every other port under the sea." Thorn didn't listen. He leveled the steam cannon. With a violent thrum, a jet of superheated vapor erupted from the nozzle. Silas dove behind a massive brass gear just as the steam stripped the paint and scorched the metal where he had been standing. The lethality of Thorn's weapon came from the latent heat of vaporization. At the pressures his boiler was maintaining, the steam was likely escaping at over 250 degrees Celsius. "Clara, now!" Silas yelled. Clara spun from behind a pillar and hurled a glass flask. It didn't contain an explosive, but a highly concentrated cooling agent, liquid nitrogen she had distilled using the archive's ancient refrigeration schematics. The flask shattered against the steam cannon's hose. The rubber and canvas instantly froze, turning brittle as glass. Thorn pulled the trigger again. The pressure surge hit the frozen section of the hose, and it shattered into 1,000 jagged shards. The steam cannon died with a pathetic hiss, and the back pressure sent a jolt of scalding water back into the Sovereign's hold. "My engine!" Thorn screamed, falling to his knees as his ship let out a final, metallic death groan. Silas didn't wait. He leaped onto the base of the anvil. He reached for the first slot, the gold. The key was glowing so brightly it was translucent. As he shoved it into the sun-shaped keyhole, the first arm of the anvil groaned and began to descend, its gears turning with a sound like a mountain moving. "One down." Silas breathed. But as the gold key seated, the temperature in the room didn't drop. It spiked. The silver and iron slots began to vent blue flame. "Silas, hurry!" Clara cried, pointing at the magma lake. "The crust is cracking. We're running out of time." The gold key sat deep in its socket, but the Anvil of Ages wasn't satisfied. The first mechanical arm had locked into place, but the secondary and tertiary arms were vibrating with a violent, erratic frequency. Blue fire licked at the edges of the empty silver and iron slots, and the air in the cavern began to hum at a pitch so low it made Silas's teeth ache. "The thermal expansion is uneven," Clara shouted, shielding her face from a spray of sparks. The gold key started the process, but without the silver to cool the reaction and the iron to ground the electrical discharge, the whole anvil is going to fracture. Silas scrambled toward the second arm, the one marked with the crescent moon. The silver key in his hand felt like a shard of ice, a strange sensation in a room filled with magma. But as he reached for the slot, a massive explosion rocked the dock. The Sovereign of Soot had finally succumbed to the internal pressure. Its main boiler had detonated, sending a shower of iron plating across the platform. A jagged piece of the hull slammed into the base of the anvil, pinning the silver arm in a half-descended position. "It's jammed!" Silas roared, straining against the heavy metal beam. "The gears are locked." Thorn, covered in soot and bleeding from a cut on his forehead, crawled toward them. He wasn't reaching for a weapon this time. He was reaching for the silver key. "If I can't have the power, no one will." "Stay back, Thorn." Silas kicked the merchant away, but the distraction cost him precious seconds. The magma lake below had begun to rise, the liquid fire lapping at the edges of the brass dock. Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy iron pry bar from a nearby tool rack and jammed it into the gear assembly. "Silas, use the key. The silver isn't just a lock, it's a lubricant for the energy. Once it's in, the cold will shrink the pins and free the arm." Silas lunged forward, pressing the silver key into the crescent-shaped hole. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a wave of frost erupted from the keyhole, racing up the mechanical arm. The screeching of the metal stopped instantly. The silver light neutralized the gold heat, creating a shimmering, purple aura around the anvil. With a heavy clunk, the second arm dropped into its final position. The pressure in the room dropped noticeably, but the danger wasn't over. The iron key, the heaviest and most humble of the three, was now glowing with a dark, earthy red. "The ground!" Silas yelled, looking at the third and final arm. "We need to seat the iron before the electrical buildup fries the whole ship." The air was now thick with static. Silas's hair stood on end, and small bolts of lightning danced between the masts of the blue moon. The iron key was the only thing that could channel this massive surge of energy back into the planet's crust. He gripped the iron key with both hands. It felt like trying to hold a living, breathing mountain. Every step toward the final slot was a struggle against a magnetic force that wanted to repel him. "Together!" Clara shouted, grabbing Silas's shoulders to add her weight to his. They shoved the iron key into the square socket. The iron key didn't just slide into the square socket, it was pulled. The moment the metal teeth touched the internal tumblers, a violent magnetic force yanked the key from Silas and Clara's hands, seating it with a heavy, metallic vibration through the very bedrock of the cavern. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. The screaming steam, the roaring magma, and the frantic clanking of gears vanished. Then, the anvil of ages began to glow. It wasn't the harsh, blinding light of the gold or the freezing radiance of the silver. It was a deep, warm amber, the color of honey and ancient sap. The three mechanical arms, now perfectly aligned in a triangular formation, began to rotate, slowly at first, then faster and faster until they were a blur of bronze and light. The great calibration. The forge was no longer a chaotic mess of pressure and heat. It was a giant clock, and the keys were its pendulum. Silas watched as the rivers of magma were diverted into narrow, controlled channels, and the freezing seawater from the overhead vents was misted into a fine, cooling spray. "The thermal efficiency is hitting 100%. Clara whispered, her eyes fixed on a massive brass gauge that had previously been buried in the red zone. "The energy isn't being wasted as heat or noise anymore. It's being converted into a pure, resonant frequency." The sound that followed was the heartbeat. It was a low, rhythmic pulse that thrummed through the water, the air, and the bones of everyone on the dock. It was the sound of the planet breathing. Across the cavern, the ruined sovereign of soot began to sink. Without the stolen energy of the seeds to hold its warped iron plates together, the ship was being reclaimed by the Lake of Light. Thorn stood on the tilting deck, his hands reaching out not for a weapon, but for the light of the anvil. It's beautiful," Thorn murmured, his madness finally replaced by a hollow, quiet awe. "I wanted to own it. But you can't own a heartbeat." With a final release of steam, the ironclad slipped beneath the surface. Thorn went with it, a man who had tried to industrialize the divine and found himself consumed by his own furnace. The return of the mist. As the forge stabilized, the sun's breath mist began to pour from the ceiling vents. It wasn't the golden mist of the lagoon, but a clear, shimmering vapor that tasted of the freshest rain. It filled the cavern, lifting the blue moon off the brass dock and buoying her up toward the central flume. "The current is reversing," Barnaby shouted from the quarterdeck. "The forge is pumping the water back out. We're going home." Silas grabbed the railing of his ship, looking back at the anvil one last time. The 3 keys were gone, dissolved into the mechanism they had served to restart. The forge was closed, its work once again a secret kept by the deep. "We did it, Silas," Clara said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "The balance is back. The sun will stay in the sky, and the whales will keep singing." "And we," Silas said, a weary but triumphant grin spreading across his face, "have a ship to sail and a horizon that finally looks clear." The ascent was not the violent, spinning nightmare of the vortex. Instead, the blue moon was carried upward on a literal pillar of water, a massive, vertical current generated by the Abyss Forge's stabilized thermal pumps. It was a smooth, rapid rise through a translucent tunnel of sapphire light. Schools of bioluminescent fish darted around the hull, and for a few minutes, the crew felt weightless, as if the ship were flying through a liquid sky. "The pressure is equalizing," Clara noted, watching the mercury in her barometer drop in a steady, rhythmic dance. "The forge isn't just pushing us, it's conditioning the water around the hull. We're in a pocket of perfect sea." Breaking the surface. With a sudden, explosive release of water, the blue moon breached the surface of the ocean. She didn't just bob, she leaped, her bow cutting through the waves and her hull returning to the salt spray with a triumphant impact. The air was no longer thick with the sulfur and coal smoke of Thorn's industrial nightmare. It was crisp, cold, and tasted of the open Atlantic. The sky above was a deep, bruised purple, the first light of a new dawn. "Look at the horizon," Silas whispered, his hand resting on the salt-crusted wheel. To the north, the greasy black smear of the sovereign of soot smoke was gone. In its place, a vibrant, golden sunrise was beginning to bleed across the water. The sons of the sun seeds that Thorn had tried to burn had been neutralized at the source. The energy was no longer being forced into pistons and boilers. It was returning to the atmosphere as light. "We have no gold, Captain," Miller said, looking at the empty treasure chests in the hold. "Thorn's debt is gone, but we're a poor ship again." "Are we, Miller?" Silas asked, pointing to the deck. Where the sun's breath mist had settled on the wooden planks, it hadn't evaporated. It had crystallized. The entire deck of the Blue Moon was dusted with a fine, glowing sand, the salt of the soul from the archive. A single handful of it was worth more than a year's haul of spices or silk. It was a gift from the deep, a reward for those who didn't steal the heart, but saved it. "We have enough to fix the ship, feed the crew, and retire to a quiet island if we wanted to." Barnaby laughed, running his hands through the glowing dust. "I don't think any of us are ready for quiet, Barnaby," Silas said, looking at the sun compass. The needle was no longer spinning. It was pointing steady and true toward the south, toward the island where Marcus waited, and beyond that, toward the next mystery of the shifting seas. The morning sun over the Atlantic was a colossal, unblemished disk of gold. It didn't just illuminate the water, it seemed to saturate it, turning the deep blue of the swells into a shifting field of sapphires. The blue moon sailed south, her new canvas white and taut, the scorched wood of her hull now polished and gleaming with the residue of the salt of the soul. "Captain, look at the wake," Barnaby said, pointing over the stern. The ship wasn't just cutting through the water, she was leaving a trail of bioluminescent light that lingered for miles. It was a sign that the forge's calibration had reached even the surface currents. The ocean was healthy again, its temperature stabilized and its deep-sea heart beating in a steady, ancient rhythm. The new mission. Clara sat at the navigation table, but she wasn't looking at the old paper maps Thorn had provided. She was staring into a small, crystalline basin filled with seawater. Since the return from the forge, her connection to the archive had remained open. Images flickered in the water, glimpses of distant islands, submerged cities, and currents that moved in impossible directions. "Silas, the world is much larger than we ever imagined," Clara whispered, her voice filled with a scholarly hunger. The Sun Temple and the Abyss Forge were just two nodes in a global network. There are others. In the Arctic ice, under the deserts of the East, and deep in the heart of the Amazon. "And Thorn's people?" Silas asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Oakhaven won't forget the sovereign of soot sinking." Thorn was a symptom, not the cause. Clara replied, "The greed for the sons of the sun will always be there. But now, we know how to protect the balance. We aren't just pirates, Silas. We're the keepers of the current." The warden's greeting. 2 days later, the emerald peaks of the resurrected island appeared on the horizon. As they drew closer, they saw a figure standing on the whale's tooth rock. It was Marcus, but he was no longer the wild man they had left behind. He wore a cloak of woven sea silk, and his spear was topped with a fragment of the obsidian tree, now turned into a harmless, glowing crystal. The whale sang all night. Marcus shouted as the longboat approached the shore. "He says the forge is quiet. He says the deep is at peace." "He's right, Marcus," Silas said, stepping onto the sand. The jungle behind them was humming with life, the sons of the sun having grown into a forest of fruit that could feed a continent without being refined into soot and smoke. They spent the night on the island, a feast of honeyfruit and clear spring water, under the light of the southern eye. Silas gathered his crew. "We have a choice," Silas began, looking at the 40 men and women who had survived the vortex. "We have the wealth to buy a kingdom. We could burn this salt, take the gold, and never see a wave again." "Not a chance, Captain," Miller yelled, and a roar of agreement followed. "Then we sail," Silas said, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "We sail to the places the maps don't show. We guard the temples. We protect the whales, and we make sure the industrial shadow never reaches the heart of the world again." As the blue moon turned back toward the open sea at dawn, the great silver whale breached one last time in her wake, a massive, shining arc of silver that seemed to salute the ship and her crew. Silas took the wheel, his hand steady and his heart light. The debt was paid, the world was saved, and the final horizon was only the beginning.